Hello and welcome. Tonight, we are opening 16 reported encounters from across the United States. In each account, the strange event was only the beginning. For now, find a comfortable position, dim the lights, settle in, and let the day begin to fall away. If these quiet encounters keep you company, remember to like and subscribe so you do not miss the stories still waiting here each day. Chapter 1. The turn no aircraft could make. The sun had been below the horizon for about 20 minutes when the pilot began the final part of his flight home. He was cruising at roughly 5,500 feet in a Cessna 172, passing over the farmland outside Wichita, Kansas. The business trip had been routine. The flight back had been just as ordinary. Below him, long fields of corn were fading into the last dull light of a late September evening. The sky still held enough color to see the ground clearly. The western horizon was pale orange, while everything toward the east had already turned blue-gray. Farmhouses appeared as scattered points of light. Thin roads cut between the fields. There was little traffic in the area. The radio had been quiet for several minutes. The pilot first noticed the object at the edge of his vision. Something to his right had caught the remaining sunlight. At first, he assumed it was another small aircraft turning toward him. A moment later, he considered a drone. It seemed low enough to be operating over the farmland, though it was difficult to judge the distance. He turned his head and studied it more carefully. The object did not resemble any plane he knew. Its surface appeared metallic and reflective. The shape was something like a flattened diamond, but the edges were rounded rather than sharp. There were no wings, no tail, no blinking navigation lights. He could not see an engine, a rotor, or any opening in its surface. It simply held its position above the fields. The pilot adjusted his own heading slightly, trying to gain a better angle. He had spent enough time in the air to know how distance could distort shape and the speed. A familiar aircraft viewed from the wrong direction could briefly appear strange. He waited for the illusion to correct itself. It did not. The object remained steady, reflecting the last light of the evening from a smooth surface. It made no visible movement caused by wind. There was no vibration, no banking, and no gradual change of direction. His first serious thought was that he might be seeing an experimental military craft. Kansas had wide open land, sparse population, and enough military activity in the wider region to make the idea possible. If someone wanted to test a new aircraft away from attention, empty farmland at dusk would offer privacy. Then the object turned. It moved sharply to the left through a precise 90-degree angle. There was no banking motion. It did not curve into the turn. It did not slow before changing direction or accelerate after completing it. The craft seemed to slide along one invisible line, stop following that line, and begin following another. A perfect corner in open air. The pilot had spent years learning what speed did to an aircraft. Even a strong airframe needed room to change direction. A tight turn forced weight against the wings, the frame, and the person inside. The faster the movement, the greater the strain. What he had just seen allowed no room at all. Impossible. For several seconds, he forgot to check his own instruments. He watched the object move away toward a low ridge of trees, still holding the same height, and still making no sound he could hear above his engine. He changed course and followed. It was not a reckless chase. He did not dive toward the fields or push the Cessna beyond a safe speed. He simply adjusted his heading enough to keep the object in view and moved closer to the ridge. The metallic shape passed behind the trees. The pilot expected it to appear on the other side. Nothing emerged. He continued along the ridge and looked beyond it. The land opened into more fields, a narrow road, and another distant band of trees. The sky was empty in every direction. There was no trail, no fading light, no sound over the radio. Every instrument in the Cessna showed a normal reading. The engine ran smoothly. The compass held steady. The radio frequency remained clear and silent. He circled once, then turned for home. His airstrip was private and familiar. He had landed there countless times, often after dark. Yet, when the wheels touched down just after 8 p.m., his hands were shaking hard enough that he noticed it while working the controls. He taxied toward the small hangar and shut down the engine. That was when he saw the two men. They were standing beside his truck. Both wore black uniforms without badges, name tags, or visible insignia. Their clothes looked official, without identifying any office or branch. Neither man waved. Neither approached while the pilot climbed out of the Cessna. A black sport utility vehicle was parked nearby. It had no visible license plates. The taller man spoke first. "Do you believe in physics or just experience?" The pilot remained beside the aircraft. He asked who they were and how they had entered the property. Neither answered. The second man held a small black device in both hands. It had no screen the pilot could clearly see. The man's fingers moved over its surface in short, careful motions, as though entering information or checking readings. The taller man asked what the pilot had seen over the farmland. The pilot had not called anyone. He had made no radio report. He had not spoken to his wife, Lisa, or written anything down. The only people who could have known where he had been were those who had watched his flight. He told the men that he had seen an aircraft he could not identify. The taller man asked about its shape. Then he asked about the turn. The pilot demanded again to know who they were. The second man briefly looked up from the device. "We already know." The words were spoken without anger. That made them worse. The taller man asked whether the object had seemed aware that the pilot was watching it. The question caught him off guard. Until that moment, he had thought of the craft as something he had observed. He had not considered that it might have noticed him in return. He said he did not know. The men appeared satisfied. They walked toward the black vehicle. Before reaching it, the taller man stopped and looked back. "You'll hear from us again. Until then, keep your experience to yourself." They entered the sport utility vehicle and drove away. No headlights came on until it reached the edge of the property. The pilot stood beside his aircraft for several minutes after the vehicle disappeared. When he finally went inside, Lisa noticed the change immediately. He was quieter than usual. His hands were still unsteady. She later said he looked as though he had brought something home from the flight, though there was nothing visible to carry. He told her only that the trip had been strange. During the following weeks, small problems began over the same stretch of farmland. On several flights, his radio produced bursts of static, lasting about 30 seconds. The frequency had been clear before each burst and returned to normal afterward. No nearby pilots reported the same interference. His handheld global positioning system also began losing its signal in the area. The failure occurred on repeated passes, often near the ridge where the object had vanished. Once he left that section of airspace, the signal returned. The Cessna was inspected. Nothing was wrong with it. The pilot began to feel watched whenever he flew across those fields. He never saw the black vehicle again, and the two men did not return, but the feeling remained. It was strongest near dusk, when the land below became dark and reflective surfaces caught the last light. He eventually spoke to Mr. Jenkins, a retired crop duster pilot who had worked around Wichita for decades. Jenkins listened without interrupting. He did not laugh or offer an easy answer. When the pilot finished, the older man looked toward the airfield and spoke quietly. He was not the first. People around there had seen things, Jenkins said. Pilots, farmers, and men working equipment. Late at night, most kept the stories to themselves. No one around there talked about it. An experimental drone remains the most reasonable answer for the object itself. Military aircraft are tested in secret, and unusual designs can look impossible when seen briefly from a distance. But a conventional airframe cannot make a 90-degree turn at speed without slowing or breaking apart. And no ordinary test program explains how two unidentified men knew where the pilot would land before he had told anyone what he had seen. The pilot still flies. He no longer crosses that part of the farmland unless the route leaves him no practical choice. When it does, he watches the instruments closely. He keeps one hand near the radio and avoids looking too long toward the ridge. On certain evenings, when the sun has just gone down and the fields still hold a little light, he catches a metallic gleam near the edge of his vision. By the time he turns to face it, the sky is empty. He has never learned whether those brief flashes are aircraft, distant machinery, or reflections from the ground, but he always remembers the question asked beside his truck. Had the object known he was watching? Years later, he still has no answer. He only wonders whether it is watching now. Chapter 2. The Corrected Data. Jen Marshall had spent years studying what animals did after the rest of the world went dark. Her work took her into forests where human activity faded early, and the night belonged to wings, small movements, and sounds most people never noticed. In late September, she was working near Ashland, Oregon, from a compact research trailer parked at the edge of a clearing. The project focused on nocturnal animal behavior. Jen tracked the movement of owls and bats, checked motion sensors, reviewed camera footage, and compared nightly patterns against weather, temperature, and changes in the surrounding woods. Most evenings followed a familiar order. She logged the conditions, checked the equipment, walked the same short paths, and listened for the first bats emerging above the trees. The work was slow, but that was part of its value. Small changes mattered. A roost emptying 10 minutes early could mean something. An owl avoiding a normal hunting route could mean something else. Around 11 p.m. one night, Jen stepped outside to inspect two sensors near the tree line. The air was still. Pine needles softened her footsteps, and the damp ground carried the heavy smell of bark and earth. Insects moved through the grass, somewhere farther into the forest. An owl called once, and then fell quiet. Jen was halfway to the first sensor when she noticed a pale glow above the canopy. It hovered about 100 feet over the trees. The light was not sharp or concentrated. It seemed diffuse, as though it had no visible center. Its color was mostly white, with a faint bluish tint around the edges. It did not pulse. It did not blink. It did not sweep across the ground. It simply remained there. Jen watched for movement that might reveal a drone. She had seen drones used for forestry surveys and search work. Even at a distance, they usually shifted against the air. Their lights changed angle. Their motors carried through open spaces between the trees. This light made no sound, not a faint hum, not the distant buzz of rotors, nothing. She took out her phone and opened the camera. The trees came into focus immediately. The upper branches were clear on the screen, and the darker line of the canopy held steady. But each time she aimed toward the light, the image softened. The glow spread into a pale blur. She tapped the screen to focus. The camera corrected for a moment, then lost the object again. She lowered the phone and looked with her own eyes. The light was still there. Jen tried once more, bracing the phone with both hands. On the screen, the bright patch seemed larger than it appeared above the trees. It washed across nearby pixels without lighting the branches beneath it. Then it vanished. There was no fading and no movement into the distance. 1 second, the light hovered above the canopy. The next, only the night sky remained. Jen stayed near the sensors for several minutes. She listened for an aircraft moving away beyond the ridge. She watched for the glow to return between the trees. Nothing changed. Back inside the trailer, she checked the motion sensors first. They had recorded ordinary movement, a small animal near the western edge of the clearing. A brief disturbance in the brush, nothing above the tree line. The trail cameras were equally unhelpful. Their footage showed dark trunks, empty paths, and occasional flashes of animal eyes. No strange light appeared in any frame. The forest had kept no record of what she had seen. For the next several nights, Jen spent more time outside than her schedule required. She watched the canopy while pretending to check equipment. She left one camera pointed toward the same stretch of sky. The glow did not return. About a week later, someone knocked on the trailer door just after dusk. Jen was alone. The nearest occupied building was far enough away that visitors normally called before driving out. She opened the door. Only partway, 2 men stood outside. Both wore dark suits and carried laminated identification cards on thin chains around their necks. The first introduced himself as Agent Blake. The second gave the name Agent Crane. They said they represented a federal wildlife compliance office. Jen had worked with state agencies, federal land managers, and research oversight boards. She knew the departments connected to permits, wildlife handling, protected species, and environmental reporting. She had never heard of the office they named. Blake spoke with the calm patience of someone explaining a routine procedure. They were reviewing irregularities in field research from the area, he said. I needed to ask about recent changes in animal activity. Jen asked to see the identification again. The cards looked official at a glance. Each carried a photograph, printed text, and a seal she could not place. Neither man offered a phone number for verification before entering. Jen let them inside. The trailer was narrow with a desk along one wall and equipment cases stacked beneath it. Blake sat near the notes. Crane remained standing for several minutes before taking the second chair. They asked about owl movement first, then bats. Their questions were specific enough to suggest they had read her reports. They knew which roosts she monitored and which sensors had shown small changes earlier that month. Jen answered carefully. When Blake asked whether she had noticed anything unusual above the trees, she said no. Crane watched her without writing anything down. The men spent close to an hour reviewing her records. They examined raw numbers, handwritten notes, and printed movement charts. Crane occasionally touched one of the pages and then looked toward Blake, but the two rarely spoke to each other. Near the end of the visit, Blake closed the folder in front of him. Some of it seems imaginative, he said. We're here to help get the records in order. The words were polite. The meaning was not. Jen asked what he meant by imaginative. Blake smiled without changing his tone. He said field researchers sometimes allowed expectation to shape interpretation. Patterns could look unusual when viewed too closely. Jen reminded him that the numbers came from sensors. Neither man responded. They stood, thanked her for cooperating, and left the trailer. Jen watched from the doorway as they crossed the clearing. She had not heard a vehicle arrive, but beyond the trees she saw a dark car, partly hidden near the access track. Within seconds, its lights disappeared into the forest. Only after locking the door did she notice the folder on her desk. It had not been there before. The folder was sealed and marked with 2 printed words: corrected data. Inside were copies of her own reports. At first, they looked unchanged. The formatting matched, the headings were right. Her name appeared in the correct places. Even the small spacing mistakes from her original documents had been copied. Then Jen began comparing the pages. The numbers were different. The changes were subtle. A rise in owl activity had been lowered. A sudden drop in bat movement had been spread across several nights. Irregular paths recorded near the clearing had been smoothed into ordinary patterns. Details she remembered entering were gone. Nothing had been changed enough to look false. That was what disturbed her most. The corrected version did not replace her work with obvious lies. It made the forest appear more consistent than it had been. The strange parts had been removed. The next morning, Jen tried the numbers printed on the identification cards. Both lines were dead. She searched for the Wildlife Compliance Office Blake and Crane had named. No federal directory listed it. No colleague recognized it. The regional contacts she trusted had never heard of such inspections being carried out at private research trailers. No one could confirm that the 2 agents existed. Within days, the animal activity around the clearing changed sharply. Jen found a dozen dead birds beneath a roost. She had checked many times before. There were no visible wounds, no broken wings, no signs of a predator feeding on them. They appeared to have fallen from the trees. The local wildlife center had received no similar reports from nearby areas. The staff could not offer an immediate explanation. The bats also stopped emerging. For several evenings, Jen stood beside the trailer at the usual time and watched an empty sky. The roost remained occupied, according to earlier signs, yet no bats crossed the clearing. The forest still made noise, but its rhythm had changed. Then her laptop failed. The day after the visit, it shut down without warning and would not restart. A technician later told her the storage drive was damaged beyond normal repair. Some files existed in backup copies. Others did not. Her field notes began disappearing from folders where she knew she had saved them. A document would open with entire sections missing. A chart she had reviewed the night before would appear under the same file name with cleaner, calmer numbers. Each time she moved closer to the original record, the record seemed to move away. Jen stopped sleeping in the trailer. She relocated it several miles from the clearing and paused the field work while she reviewed what remained. Officially, the decision was due to equipment problems and unusual animal deaths. Privately, she no longer felt alone there. She kept the corrected reports, though she stored them separately from everything else. She read them sometimes, not because they were useful, but because they proved the visit had happened. Agent Blake and Agent Crane never returned. The pale light never appeared again. Jen eventually resumed other work, but not at that clearing. She has never found an agency that admits to employing the men, and she has never learned how they obtained her original files. What stays with her is not only the glow above the trees, it is the care taken afterward. Someone had studied her work closely enough to change it without destroying it. The numbers had been softened. The irregular movement had been made ordinary. The evidence had not vanished in one dramatic act. It had been corrected. Jen once described the forest as feeling different after that night. Not damaged, not empty, shifted. She could never explain what had changed, only that the place she left was not quite the place she had entered. Chapter 3. The video that vanished overnight. Mr. Porter could not sleep. It was nearly 1 a.m. in Franklin, Illinois, and the house had gone still around him. Rather than lie awake staring at the ceiling, he stepped outside and walked toward the soybean fields behind his property. The land there was open and flat. Grain silos stood far off against the dark, and gravel roads crossed the fields in long, pale lines. On clear nights, the stars seemed close enough to sharpen the edges of the barns. Mr. Porter had taken the same walk many times. He knew where the neighboring security lights should appear. He knew which distant towers blinked red. He knew the slow movement of aircraft crossing toward larger cities. The 3 white lights above the field belonged to none of those patterns. They hung near the far edge of the soybeans, about 30 feet above the ground. Each light was pale and steady. None of them blinked. There was no colored glow around them, and no beam reaching down into the field. They appeared evenly spaced, forming a shape that Mr. Porter could sense without being able to see anything solid between them. At first, he assumed they were drones. The idea faded when he listened. No rotors, no engine, no distant electrical hum, even from that far end of the field. 3 ordinary drones should have made some sound. Instead, the lights remained suspended in complete silence. Mr. Porter took out his phone. As he began recording, the entire arrangement started to move. The lights did not drift independently. They shifted together, maintaining the same distance from one another, as though fixed to a single hidden frame. The formation rotated slowly in place, stopped, and then glided sideways toward the tree line. The movement was smooth. There was no shaking from wind, and no correction between one light and the next. He filmed for about 2 minutes. The lights passed in front of the darker trees and became easier to see. For a moment, Mr. Porter thought he could make out a broad shape behind them, but the phone screen showed only 3 pale points, moving across black space. They never rose higher. They never came closer. After less than 2 minutes, the light slipped behind the trees and disappeared. Mr. Porter stayed beside the field, waiting for them to return from the other side. Nothing emerged. The sky above the trees remained clear. He watched the video twice before walking back to the house. The footage was not sharp, but it showed what he had seen. 3 steady lights. Their arrangement. The slow rotation. The sideways movement. He cut a 30-second section and posted it to TikTok. His caption was simple. He asked whether anyone else was seeing this over Franklin. Mr. Porter expected a few local replies. Perhaps someone would identify farm equipment or a drone club testing new gear. He placed the phone beside his bed and finally fell asleep. By morning, the clip had tens of thousands of views. Comments were arriving faster than he could read them. Some people called it fake. Others argued over drones, lanterns, and aircraft seen through haze. Several users claimed they had watched similar lights that same night. One person wrote from Indiana. Another mentioned Missouri. A third said the same formation had been seen over part of Oregon. Mr. Porter began saving screenshots of the most detailed replies. He was still reading them when someone knocked on his front door at 8:30 a.m. 2 men stood on the porch. Their clothes were nearly identical, black suits white shirts, narrow black ties. Both wore thin-framed dark glasses. Even though the morning light was weak, they were the same height and almost the same build. For a second, Mr. Porter wondered whether they were brothers. The first man smiled. Half a second later, the second man copied the expression. Both smiles were too wide, with closed lips held in place slightly longer than a natural greeting required. The first man spoke. "Just checking in, making sure you've been feeling safe lately." Mr. Porter asked who they were. The man did not answer. He tilted his head slightly, as though the question had not been important enough to hear. The second man looked past Mr. Porter into the house. "You've just had a busy night." Neither of them mentioned the lights. They did not ask to see the video. They did not name TikTok. They did not say they knew he had been outside. That absence made their meaning clear. Mr. Porter kept one hand on the door and asked again what they wanted. The first man's smile remained unchanged. He said there was no need for concern. They were only checking in. The second man glanced toward the field behind the house, though it was not visible from the porch. The visit lasted less than 2 minutes. The men thanked him for his time and walked toward a black sedan parked at the curb. Unlike many stories built around unmarked cars, this one carried ordinary Illinois plates. The sedan sat still for about 5 seconds after both doors closed. Then it pulled away. Mr. Porter locked the door and returned to his phone. The video was gone. Its page still existed, but the clip had been replaced by a message saying it was no longer available. There was no notice explaining why, no warning about a rule violation, no copyright claim, no record of a takedown request. He opened his account settings. At first, the profile appeared normal. A few seconds later, the screen refreshed and returned him to the login page. His password no longer worked. When he tried to recover the account, the platform said no user existed under his name or email address. The account had not been suspended. It had ceased to exist. Mr. Porter went to his computer and connected the backup hard drive where his phone files were copied. The drive made a soft clicking sound. It did not appear on the screen. He unplugged it, waited, and tried again. The clicking continued. He connected it to a second computer. Nothing. He checked his cloud storage next, hoping the original 2-minute recording had been uploaded. The automatic sync had been turned off. He did not remember changing the setting. By late morning, links to the clip were spreading across several forums and social media pages. Mr. Porter clicked them one by one. Every embedded player showed a blank thumbnail. Every copy led to a dead page. Posts discussing the footage remained online, but the footage itself had disappeared from all of them. A night can leave many traces. This one had been unmade. Mr. Porter spent the following days trying to recover the files. He used 3 different recovery programs on the hard drive. Each found fragments of older photographs, documents, and videos from months before. Nothing carried a timestamp from the night of the sighting. Not a thumbnail, not a damaged clip, not a partial file. He had watched the recording before posting it. Thousands of other people had watched the shorter version. Now there was no surviving image at all. Mr. Porter began asking around Franklin. Ben Holloway lived 2 roads over and often hunted near the soybean fields. When Mr. Porter asked whether he had seen anything strange that night, Ben answered too quickly, no. He had not seen lights. He had not heard anything. His words were short and clipped, ending the conversation before Mr. Porter had described what the lights looked like. A woman working at the local hardware store remembered something else. Her dogs had begun barking around 1 a.m. and would not stop for several minutes. David stood facing the back of the property, growling toward the open fields. She had looked outside, but seen nothing. Online, the simplest explanation remained a computer-generated hoax. It was possible to create 3 moving lights with basic editing software. The footage had been dark, and no visible object had appeared between them. But a person staging a hoax usually wants the attention it brings. Mr. Porter gained nothing. Within 12 hours, he lost the video, the account that had posted it, and a working backup drive. He also received 2 visitors who spoke as though they knew exactly how his night had been spent. He never saw the men again. Their ordinary license plate led nowhere useful. He had not written down the full number, and the memory blurred as the days passed. Mr. Porter bought another hard drive. He checks it almost every day. He keeps several copies of ordinary family photographs and work documents, testing the files to make sure nothing has changed. The new drive has never failed. He has not recorded anything unusual since. He has not tried. The late walks ended after that morning. When he cannot sleep now, he stays inside. Sometimes he stands near a dark window and looks toward the fields without turning on a light. The soybeans are cut and planted according to the season. The grain silos remain where they have always been. Cars pass on distant roads. Everything looks familiar. Yet the tree line no longer feels empty. Mr. Porter does not describe the feeling as being watched. Watching suggests curiosity. What he feels is closer to patience, as though something beyond the field already knows where he lives and is simply waiting to see whether he tries to record it again. Chapter 4. The waiver at the radio tower. The driver left Mena, Arkansas, a little after 7 p.m. He had spent the day at a client meeting and expected a simple 3-hour trip back to Little Rock. The weather was clear. Traffic was light. He was tired in the ordinary way that follows a long workday, but alert enough to notice when his navigation system offered a detour around construction near Ola. The new route saved only a few minutes. He accepted it anyway. The main road narrowed, then gave way to a winding rural stretch near Forsh Mountain. Trees pressed close on both sides. There were few houses, no businesses, and almost no other vehicles. The road rose and fell through the dark. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Then the driver noticed how quiet the night had become. It was late September. In that part of Arkansas, insects and tree frogs should have filled the spaces between passing cars. Instead, he heard only the tires beneath him. No crickets, no frogs, not even the usual rustle of leaves beyond the shoulder. Ahead, an old radio tower rose above the trees. Its frame was painted in faded red and white sections. The light at the top should have blinked in a steady pattern to warn aircraft away. It was not blinking. The beacon burned as one solid red point. The driver watched it through the windshield as the road curved closer. He assumed the light had developed a fault. Old towers often carried old equipment. Then the engine changed. The sound softened first. The revolutions per minute dropped and held low, even though his foot had not moved from the accelerator. The vehicle began to lose speed. He pressed the pedal. The engine did not respond. A few seconds later, the headlights dimmed to about half their normal brightness. The dashboard lights flickered once. The radio display remained on, but the music disappeared. White noise filled the cabin. The driver changed stations. Every frequency held the same empty hiss. He slowed and pulled toward the shoulder. That was when he looked up at the tower again. Something dark was hanging beside it. The shape was broad and smooth, like an overturned dinner plate seen from below. It floated roughly 50 feet above the top of the tower and slightly to one side. The object appeared wider than the tower's upper platform. There were no lights on it. Its surface reflected nothing from the red beacon, no moonlight, no glow from the vehicle. It seemed less like a dark object against the sky, and more like a section of the sky where light had stopped working. The driver stared through the windshield. The shape did not drift. Wind moved the treetops around it, but the object remained perfectly still. His engine weakened further. Then it stopped. The silence came all at once. The driver turned the key. There was no click from the starter, no attempt from the engine. The vehicle behaved as though the battery had been removed. The cabin light switched on by itself. For half a second, the air conditioning blew hot air into his face. Then that stopped too. He sat with both hands on the steering wheel, watching the object above the tower. Time became difficult to judge. He later said his senses seemed delayed, as if each sound and movement reached him a moment after it happened. His breathing felt distant. The red light on the tower appeared too bright, though it cast no visible glow across the object. The shape moved. It slid sideways about 20 feet. There was no tilt and no change in height. It shifted in one controlled motion, then began sinking behind the trees. The movement was slow enough to follow, yet completely wrong for anything supported by wings or rotors. Gravity did not seem to act on it. The upper edge disappeared first, then the broad center. Finally, the last dark curve slipped behind the tree line. The tower beacon blinked once. Music returned in the middle of a song. The dashboard lights brightened, and the engine started on the first turn of the key. The driver remained on the shoulder for several seconds. He checked the mirrors. No vehicles approached from either direction. The road behind him was empty, and the curve ahead showed nothing but trees. He drove on. The radio worked normally for the rest of the trip. The engine showed no sign of trouble. By the time he reached home around 12:30 a.m., he had almost convinced himself that two separate events had overlapped: a vehicle fault, a strange shadow near a tower. He told no one. He did not write the time down. He did not search for the tower or report the engine failure. He went inside, checked the car once from the window, and tried to sleep. The next morning, a Crown Victoria entered his driveway. It had tinted windows and a small antenna mounted near the rear. The car moved slowly and stopped close to the house. A man stepped out. He appeared to be in his mid-50s. He wore a suit and tie, but carried no badge. His clothes were neat, without looking formal, like someone arriving for a quiet business appointment. He walked up the driveway at an even pace. The driver met him outside. The man greeted him by name. Then he said he was following up on the vehicle malfunction from the previous night. The driver did not answer. The man continued. He gave the time as approximately 9:42 p.m. He named the location as the F&M Tower, west of Hollis. Every part was correct. The driver had told no one. He had not made a call. He had not entered the event into any form or website. The navigation system had chosen the detour, but he had not searched the tower or saved the location. The man reached into a thin folder and removed a single sheet of paper. At the top were the words, "Vehicle malfunction, liability release." The document was written in dense legal language. It stated that the driver had suffered no injury, that the vehicle had sustained no damage, and that no formal complaint would be filed. At the bottom, his full name had already been printed beside an empty signature line. The man held out a pen. The driver read the first paragraph again. He asked what organization the man represented. No answer came. He asked how anyone knew where he had been. The man kept the paper extended between them. No repairs necessary. Correct. The driver said the vehicle seemed to be working. He did not take the pen. The man's expression remained calm. He held the document out for several more seconds, giving the driver time to change his mind. The signature line stayed blank. At last, the man folded the paper and returned it to the folder. He thanked the driver for his time. There was no anger in his voice, no threat. The meeting carried the flat tone of unfinished paperwork. He walked back to the Crown Victoria and drove away. The driver tried to read the license plate, but dirt or a dark cover made the characters impossible to see. Later, he checked the driveway. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week. His own tires had left cleared tracks near the house. The Crown Victoria had left none. He inspected the vehicle that afternoon. The battery connections were firm. The electrical system appeared normal. Nothing in the engine showed signs of overheating or failure. A mechanic found no fault. The car has run perfectly ever since. The driver has passed through the wider area many times for work, though he avoids the road near Forsh Mountain. When his navigation system suggests that detour, he rejects it without checking how much time another route will add. He has seen the radio tower from a distance. Its beacon blinks normally. There have been no further engine failures, no white noise, no sudden darkness inside the cabin. The man has never returned with the form. What troubles the driver is not only the object above the tower. He can imagine explanations for that part. A military craft, a balloon seen from the wrong angle, a shadow made larger by darkness and fear. The paper is harder. It carried the exact minute of the failure. It named the tower. It carried his name before he had spoken to anyone. And it asked him to agree that nothing had happened. He never signed. Perhaps that is why the document still feels unfinished. Chapter 5. The morning the stars went missing. By late March, Evan had fallen into a routine. A few mornings each week, he left Santa Rosa long before sunrise and drove toward the coast. He was 31, worked part-time at a hardware store, and measured his free days by weather reports, tide tables, and the condition of the water north of Bodega Bay. The place he preferred was called Devil's Spine. It was not an easy beach. The trail crossed low scrub before dropping toward dark cliffs and a narrow stretch of water. Evan liked it because few people arrived early enough to share it with him. At around 4:45 one morning, he parked his silver 2006 Dodge van near the trail entrance. The sliding door had been broken for months. It did not close properly, and he had stopped bothering to lock it. There was rarely anyone else around at that hour. That morning, the parking area was empty. Before getting out, Evan noticed the cold. The forecast had called for temperatures in the 60s later that day, yet the air inside the van felt sharp enough to sting his hands. When he opened the door, the cold seemed deeper outside. It was not the clean cold of ocean wind. The air smelled metallic. Evan knew the scent of that coast: salt, wet rock, seaweed, and damp earth, usually mixed together before dawn. This smelled more like old coins held in a closed hand. He stood beside the van for a moment and listened. There was almost nothing to hear. No gulls called from the cliffs. No insects moved in the brush. Even the distant ocean sounded weak and far away. Evan took his board and started down the trail. Near the first view of the water, he noticed that the tide was moving strangely. The foam reached the rocks more slowly than usual. Each line of water seemed to stop before touching marks it had reached on other mornings. He watched for a few seconds, trying to judge whether the swell had simply changed direction. Then he looked up. Above the ocean, the stars were gone. The blank region began roughly 30 degrees above the horizon and continued directly overhead. It did not resemble cloud cover. There were no soft edges, no shifting patches, and no pale reflection from the lights of distant towns. It was simply empty. Evan turned toward the land. Behind him, Orion remained visible. The Pleiades still held their place above the darker hills. The rest of the inland sky appeared clear and ordinary. Only the sky above the water had been erased. He stepped farther beyond the scrub line, searching for the edge of fog or low cloud. The boundary did not move. Stars ended at a clean divide, as though a large, dark surface had been placed between the coast and the sky. Evan lowered the board. The ocean had become flat. There were no rolling swells waiting beyond the break. No white lines formed in the darkness. The surface looked smooth enough to reflect light, though there was almost no light left above it to reflect. Then the remaining sounds disappeared. The tide no longer touched the rocks. The wind stopped moving through the grass. The quiet did not feel natural. It felt imposed, as if the coast had been sealed beneath something heavy. Pressure built inside Evan's ears. It reminded him of a plane descending too quickly. He swallowed and moved his jaw, but the pressure remained. A tight weight settled across his chest. He did not see an object. He did not see lights over the water. There was only the missing sky, the still ocean, and a growing certainty that he should not stay near the cliff. Evan picked up the board and began walking back. He did not run. The path was narrow, and the ground fell away sharply in places. But he moved faster with every step. The pressure followed him until he reached the parking area. His van stood where he had left it, the broken sliding door not quite sealed. Evan placed the board against the side and climbed into the driver's seat. He turned the key. Before starting the engine, he looked into the rearview mirror. A man was sitting in the back. He wore a black suit over a black shirt. There was no tie. His skin was paper pale, and no hair was visible anywhere on his head. The man sat upright, facing forward. His hands rested flat on his knees. Evan could not judge his age. The face carried none of the usual signs that make a person seem young or old. It occupied a blank middle space, smooth in some places and deeply tired in others. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The man had entered a van with a damaged door. That should have made his presence easy to explain. Yet Evan had heard no gravel shift outside, no sliding metal, no weight settling onto the rear seat. The man spoke without turning his head. "Does the ocean ever show you things?" His voice sounded flat and hollow, as though it came through an empty room. Evan gripped the steering wheel. He asked who the man was. No answer came. The stranger continued facing the windshield. "You are here often." Evan had surfed Devil Spine several times a week since late March. He did not post his trips online. He did not follow a fixed schedule, and few people knew the exact place he used. The man slowly lifted his eyes toward the mirror. "You stay long enough. It shows you more." Evan turned around. The rear seat was empty, gone. There was no movement beside the van, no closing door, no retreating shape crossing the lot. Evan climbed out so quickly that his shoulders struck the frame. He checked beneath the van, behind the nearby brush, and along the first section of trail. The gravel around the vehicle was smooth except for his own footprints and tire marks. No one was there. He returned to the van and opened every door. The back seat held an old jacket, a towel, and 2 empty water bottles. Nothing had been moved. Evan sat on the hood for 10 or 15 minutes. He forced himself to consider the obvious possibilities. He had not been drinking. He had slept normally the night before. He had taken no drugs or medication. He had not struck his head, fallen on the trail, or felt confused before reaching the coast. The man hadn't appeared like part of a dream. Evan remembered the seams of the suit, the position of the hands, and the way the voice sounded inside the van. Everything had felt solid. A marine fog layer can cover part of the sky. A tired mind, especially before dawn, can also turn shadows into faces and fear into a person sitting where no person belongs. But fog moves. The blank region above the ocean had held a hard edge, while Orion and the Pleiades remained clear behind him. And no weather pattern explains an ocean losing its swells, or a stranger vanishing between one glance and the next. Evan drove home without surfing. He stayed away from Devil's Spine for 2 weeks. During that time, he checked the weather records and tide reports for the morning of the encounter. Nothing in them explained the cold, the silence, or the flat water. There had been no unusual storm activity, no official warning, no report of heavy fog covering only the sea. Eventually, he returned. The trail looked the same at first. The scrub had not changed. The cliffs still dropped toward the same dark rocks. Yet halfway to the water, Evan smelled copper. The scent was faint, but unmistakable. It followed him along the path and disappeared near the cliff edge. The waves had returned, but they seemed to break farther from shore. Evan estimated the line was about 10 feet beyond where he remembered it. He watched several sets, waiting for the water to return to its old pattern. It never did. He entered the water once. The session lasted less than 20 minutes. Every time he looked toward the parking area, he expected to see someone standing beside the van. Every time the light shifted across the water, he remembered the blank sky above it. He returned a few more times over the following weeks. By June, he stopped going. Evan still surfs, but he chooses busier beaches now, places with other vans in the lot, voices on the trail, and gulls making noise above the cliffs. He no longer arrives before dawn. The silver van is gone, sold years later for reasons unrelated to the encounter. But even after replacing it, Evan developed the habit of checking the back seat before starting the engine. He sometimes thinks about the man's first question. Does the ocean ever show you things? Evan had gone to Devil's Spine because the sea made his life feel simple. A wave rose, moved toward shore, and broke. Nothing stayed hidden for long. That morning, the ocean showed him only an absence. Stars missing from the sky. Sound missing from the coast. A man missing from a seat that had held him 1 second earlier. And the warning that staying might have shown him more. Chapter 6. The contact on the radar. At 9:30 p.m., the radar screen held one return that did not move. The air traffic controller had worked at the small regional airport in northern Idaho for 5 years. Most nights were quiet. A handful of private flights came and went during the day, but after dark, the tower often belonged to him alone. Early October had brought cold, clear weather. The runway lights stood bright against the dark ground, and the mountains west of the airport were only a deeper shadow beneath the stars. There were no scheduled arrivals, no departures were waiting for clearance. The radio had been silent for nearly 20 minutes. The controller noticed the contact while reviewing the empty western sector. It appeared above the normal flight paths, positioned over the mountain range beyond the airport. At first, he assumed it was an aircraft holding outside the area. He checked the traffic list. Nothing was scheduled there. The contact carried no transponder code. A transponder normally sends back the identifying information that helps a controller separate one aircraft from another. This return offered nothing. No call sign, no altitude, reading he could trust, no direction of travel. It was simply present. The controller watched for movement. The return stayed fixed in the same place. Weather can sometimes create strange marks on radar. Mountain ridges, temperature changes, and electrical interference can produce false contacts that look solid for a moment before fading. This one did not fade. It was also much larger than the ordinary blips passing through the region. The controller began checking the system. He reset the display first. The screen briefly cleared and rebuilt the picture sector by sector. The contact returned in the same position. He checked the power supply and reviewed the equipment status. No warnings appeared. Nothing showed a fault. Then he restarted the full radar system. It was not something he did casually. A complete restart took time and temporarily removed his view of the airspace. But there was no active traffic nearby, and he wanted to know whether the return belonged to the sky or only to the machine. When the display came back, the contact was waiting. Same size, same position. Still no movement. The controller selected the radio frequencies used by aircraft crossing the mountains. He called once, no answer. He called again, on another frequency. Nothing came back except the low sound of an open channel. There were no emergency transmissions, no pilot reporting equipment trouble, no voice asking for heading or permission to enter the area. He contacted the regional office of the Federal Aviation Administration, known as the FAA, and asked whether any unusual traffic had been reported west of the airport. The answer was no. There were no notices, no military movements passed along to the tower, and no aircraft expected in that part of the sky. The controller returned his attention to the screen. The contact remained perfectly still. An ordinary aircraft cannot hold one fixed point for hours without making small adjustments. Even a helicopter shifts in wind. Its radar return moves slightly as it corrects position. This return did not drift by even the smallest amount he could see. It held above the mountains, as though attached to them. The controller wrote down the time and began making notes. He recorded the system checks. He listed the frequencies he had tried. He marked the absence of a transponder code and the call to the regional office. He printed several screen captures. The pages showed the western sector, the airport, the normal ground returns, and one large, unexplained contact sitting beyond the usual routes. Around 11 p.m., the tower power flickered. It lasted less than a second. The overhead lights dimmed, the radar display blinked, and a relay clicked somewhere inside the equipment room. The backup systems did not activate because the main power returned almost immediately. The contact was still there. The controller stood near the console and watched it. The hours had made the return feel less like a technical problem and more like a presence. He knew it was only an image on a screen, a point created by radio waves returning from something beyond the airport. Still, the thought was difficult to avoid. Something was above those mountains, and it had remained there without speaking. Before midnight, the contact vanished. There was no sign of movement before it disappeared. It did not travel east, west, north, or south. It did not break apart into interference. One sweep showed it, the next did not. The controller waited for it to return. It never did. Before ending his shift, he entered a routine report into the tower logbook. The logbook was a thick binder holding the practical memory of the airport. Flight plans, unusual calls, equipment problems, weather notes, and anything a later shift might need to know were kept there. He described the event as an unidentified stationary radar contact. The wording was careful. He did not speculate about what it had been. The next day, his supervisor called. The man sounded distracted, as though he were reading something else while speaking. He asked whether the controller was certain the contact had remained in the western sector. The controller said yes. He described the restarts, the phone call, and the printed images. His supervisor paused. Then he said the stored radar data showed nothing unusual in that sector. The controller asked him to check again. The answer remained the same. No contact had been recorded. The supervisor suggested that the controller might have misread a system artifact. His tone carried mild annoyance, not concern. The conversation ended with a reminder to be more cautious before placing unusual entries in the official log. The controller returned to work that evening. He checked the western mountains as soon as the display came online. The sector was empty. At around 7 p.m., 3 men entered the tower. They had not called from the gate. No one had announced their arrival. All 3 wore identical black coats. They appeared to be in their late 40s or early 50s, with graying hair cut to nearly the same length. Their faces were different, but their expressions carried the same calm, rehearsed friendliness. Each man displayed a badge. The badges looked official. The shape, lettering, and photograph suggested some government office, but the controller could not match them to any federal or state agency he knew. He asked who had authorized the visit. One of the men said they worked in special aviation oversight. The phrase sounded formal while explaining almost nothing. The men asked to review the previous night's radar records. The controller showed them the screen captures and the notes he had kept separately. They read in silence. One man held a printed image close to the light. Another examined the hand-written report. The third looked toward the radar console, then back at the controller. "You have a very imaginative writing style for a tower, operator." The comment was delivered politely. There was no smile. The controller said he had written only what the system showed. The man placed the page down. He did not argue. Instead, the visitors said they needed 20 minutes at the radar console to calibrate equipment. The controller asked what they planned to calibrate. Their answer was vague. A routine adjustment, a regional check, something connected to the power flicker. He reminded them that the system belonged to the airport and could not be accessed without approval. One man said the approval had already been given. The controller called his supervisor. There was no answer. The men waited. Nothing in their manner suggested hurry. They behaved as though the decision had already been made, and the controller was only catching up with it. He finally stepped into the break room. He remained there for less than 20 minutes. When he returned, the tower was empty. The 3 men were gone. No footsteps sounded on the stairs. No door closed below. The controller looked through the tower windows but saw no vehicle leaving the airport. The radar screens displayed normal traffic. The western sector was clear. Then he noticed the empty shelf. The tower logbook was missing. The thick binder held far more than his report. It contained flight plans, radio call records, shift notes, equipment entries, and the practical history of the airport over many weeks. The controller searched the console, the cabinets, and the break room. The binder was nowhere in the tower. He called his supervisor again. This time, the man answered. The supervisor said no visitors had been approved, and no one had permission to remove airport records. The Federal Aviation Administration Regional Office also denied sending anyone to inspect the system or collect logs. The controller checked the security cameras covering the tower entrance. They had recorded nothing. According to the system, the cameras had been offline that evening for maintenance. No maintenance had been scheduled. No notice had been posted. No technician had signed in. Near the radar console, a faint smell remained in the air. Ozone, burnt wires. The controller checked the equipment for heat or visible damage. Everything operated normally. The smell faded before the end of the shift. Radar can produce false returns. Interference, ground reflections, and equipment faults have confused experienced operators before. But false returns do not usually survive a full restart. Equipment faults do not send 3 unidentified men into a tower. And no technical error removes a physical logbook from a shelf. The unexplained contact never appeared in that sector again. The controller remained at the airport for a while, but his trust in the work had changed. The radar screen had once seemed like a clean record of what occupied the sky. After that night, it felt more like a record someone else could revise. He eventually left the job. Years later, the missing binder still troubles him, more than the contact itself. Something large may have remained above the mountains for more than 2 hours, but at least the radar had seen it. For a short time, the system had held the truth. Then the visitors came. By the next evening, the screen was ordinary. The cameras had been blind, and the written record had ceased to exist. Someone had not explained what happened. They had simply removed the part that said it happened at all. Chapter 7. The Man Waiting in the Truck. The cabin belonged to Greg's uncle, though neither Greg nor his friend had visited it in years. It stood in northern Minnesota, about 40 minutes from the nearest town, with a frozen lake on one side and old logging roads stretching into the woods on the other. In winter, those roads were left unplowed. Once the snow came down hard enough, the cabin felt cut off from everything beyond the trees. That was part of the appeal. The two friends arrived on a February weekend with food, firewood, and enough supplies to avoid driving back into town until they were ready to leave. The temperature sat near 12 degrees. The sky was clear, and after dark, the stars crowded above the lake in numbers they rarely saw from home. Nothing about the first night felt unusual. They lit the stove, ate, and talked until late. The old walls creaked as the temperature dropped. Snow settled softly from branches outside. By morning, the cold had sharpened. Greg suggested hiking east toward a ridge where an abandoned fire tower still stood. His uncle had mentioned it many times, though he had warned them that the structure was unsafe. The climb took close to 2 hours. They followed a narrow path through birch and pine, sometimes losing it beneath wind-blown snow. The only tracks belonged to small animals. No snowmobile had crossed the area recently, and no other boot prints appeared along the route. The woods were quiet, but not unnaturally so. Branches moved overhead. Ice shifted somewhere beneath the frozen lake behind them. Their boots broke through the thin crust of snow with every step. The fire tower appeared near the top of the ridge. It stood about 40 feet high, built from rusted metal supports with a narrow staircase rising through the center. Several steps had partly rotted away. A faded "no trespassing" sign hung from one corner by a single wire. They stayed on the ground. Greg walked around the tower while his friend looked west through the trees. From the ridge, the land dropped into a wide forested hollow. Beyond it, the tops of distant pines formed a dark, uneven line against the pale winter sky. Greg touched his friend's arm. He did not speak. Past the tree line, west of the tower, a white orb floated above the snow. It appeared about the size of a basketball from where they stood, though the distance made its true scale impossible to judge. It was positioned 30 to 40 feet above the ground. The light was soft rather than bright. It did not cast a beam through the trees. It did not flash or pulse. Its edges seemed clear enough to suggest a round form, yet there was no visible surface inside the glow. The orb remained completely still. Greg whispered that it might be a drone. His friend listened for rotors. Nothing. There was wind on the ridge, enough to move loose snow across the ground, but the light did not drift with it. It held one exact point between the trees. The friend removed his phone. There was no service, which was normal, that far from town. He opened the camera anyway and aimed toward the orb. The screen broke into bands of static, dark and pale lines rolled across the image, hiding the forest. He lowered the phone and the display cleared. When he raised it again, the bands returned. He had never seen the device behave that way. When he looked over the phone, the orb had changed position. It was now several feet higher and slightly to the right. Neither man had seen it move. There had been no visible path between the first point and the second. One moment, it was lower. The next, it occupied another part of the air. Greg asked how long it had been there. His friend did not know. They watched for about another minute. Then the orb disappeared. It did not dim. It did not rise beyond the trees. There was no sudden burst of speed. The light simply stopped existing. The forest behind it appeared unchanged. For a moment, both men remained where they were. Neither wanted to be the first to admit that the experience had frightened him. Then Greg said they should go. The return hike took less time. They moved quickly and spoke very little. More than once, the friend believed he heard something moving through the trees beside them. The sound matched their pace without following the rhythm of their own steps. When they stopped, it stopped. When they continued, it returned. They never saw what made it. By the time the cabin appeared through the trees, both were breathing hard from more than the climb. They left their boots on inside. Greg poured whiskey into 2 cups. They sat near the stove and tried to force the sighting into ordinary explanations. A flare should have dropped. A drone should have made noise and moved with the air. A distant aircraft light should have crossed the sky, rather than holding still between trees. They discussed weather effects, reflections from ice, and hunters carrying powerful lamps. None of those answers matched the silence, or the way the orb had shifted without being seen in motion. They slept badly. The next morning, they drove into town for a few supplies. The trip gave them a reason to leave the cabin and see other people. By daylight, the story felt less immediate. They agreed not to mention it at the store. When they returned, Greg slowed before reaching the cabin. His truck was parked where they had left it. Someone was sitting in the passenger seat. At first, they saw only the side of a pale face behind the glass. Greg stopped their vehicle several yards away. The man inside the truck did not turn toward them. He appeared to be in his mid-50s. He wore a black suit beneath a dark coat. His face was clean-shaven, his hair neatly arranged, and his posture perfectly straight. The doors had been locked. Greg checked his pocket. The keys were still there. The two friends stepped out. The man in the truck opened the passenger door. He moved slowly, placing both feet in the snow before standing. His clothing looked untouched by the woods around him. No snow clung to the coat. No moisture darkened the fabric. He looked at Greg first, then at his friend. A smile formed across his face. It stayed too wide, too long. Not the smile of someone greeting strangers. It looked more like an expression being held in place, because he understood that people expected one. The man spoke softly. "That wasn't meant for you." Warmth still filled the truck. The sentence ended, and the man turned toward the trees. Neither friend stopped him. He walked away from the cabin without gloves or any proper protection against the cold. His black shoes entered deep snow, yet his pace never changed. He did not follow the trail. He moved directly between the pines. Within seconds, the dark coat blended into the trunks. Then he was gone. The two men stood beside the truck, listening. No branch snapped. No footsteps continued through the snow. Nothing moved in the forest. Greg checked the vehicle. Nothing had been taken. The glove compartment remained closed. Tools still lay behind the seats. The doors showed no damage, but the inside of the truck was warm, as if the heater had been running moments earlier. Greg placed his hand near the vents. The engine was cold. The keys had never left his pocket. That warmth stayed with them more than the man's face. They spent one more night at the cabin because darkness arrived before they felt ready to drive the unplowed roads. They locked both doors, lowered every blind, and kept the lights on. Neither drank. Every sound outside drew their attention. Snow falling from the roof, wood shifting in the stove, the slow pressure of wind against the windows. Nothing approached the cabin. At first light, they packed. Greg's uncle has invited them back many times since that weekend. There is always a reason not to go. Work, weather. Another plan's already made. Neither man has returned to the fire tower. They still speak occasionally about the orb, but the conversation always reaches the same point. The truck had been locked. Greg had carried the keys. No one should have been able to enter it, warm it, and wait inside without leaving a mark. And the man had not asked what they saw. He already knew. All he offered was a correction. It had not been meant for them. Chapter 8. The Triangle Over County Road 700E second shift ended late at the packaging plant outside Greensburg, Indiana. By the time the woman left the building, most of the parking lot had emptied. A few workers were still getting into their cars, but the roads beyond the plant were already quiet. She lived near Westport, in a small cul-de-sac, where the houses looked nearly identical after dark. The quickest route home took her near Interstate 74, before turning onto County Road 700E. At around 12:40 a.m., she left the brighter roads behind. There were no streetlights on that stretch. Corn and soybean fields pressed close to the narrow pavement, broken only by drainage ditches, utility poles, and the occasional barn set back from the road. She had driven it enough times to know every bend. The radio cut out first. The song stopped for 2 or 3 seconds, leaving complete silence inside the car. Then the sound returned at the same point, as though nothing had happened. She changed stations. The next station fell silent too. So did the one after that. Each interruption lasted only a few seconds. There was no static and no weakening signal. The audio simply disappeared. She turned the radio off. A minute later, the headlights dimmed. Both beams dropped to roughly half their normal brightness. The road ahead narrowed into a weak gray tunnel, then brightened again. She looked at the dashboard. No warning lights appeared. The engine felt normal beneath her foot, but she slowed anyway. An old barn stood ahead on the right. Half its roof had collapsed years earlier, leaving the frame open to weather. During the day, it was easy to miss among the fields. That night, something above it had removed a section of the sky. At first, she saw only darkness where stars should have been. The missing area was too wide for a cloud and too sharply shaped for a shadow. As she drew closer, the outline became clear. A triangle. It was enormous. The object floated no more than 50 feet above the ground, perhaps lower. Its body was flat, with broad sides and corners that looked softened, rather than sharp. From her position on the road, it seemed to stretch across nearly the entire field beside the barn. There was no visible cockpit, no windows, no markings. 3 dull, red points sat on the underside, one near each corner. They did not blink. They were not bright enough to light the field below. They had the dim, steady presence of small standby lights on electronic equipment. The woman lifted her foot from the accelerator and allowed the car to slow almost to a stop. The triangle drifted slightly above the crops. The movement was so small that she first blamed her own motion. Then she saw its position shift against the collapsed roof of the barn. It remained perfectly level. She pulled onto the shoulder. The engine continued running. She lowered the driver's window. Silence entered the car. There should have been crickets in the fields. There should have been wind moving through the dry plants. Even the engine, idling beneath the hood, should have been obvious. She heard none of them. The world outside the window seemed sealed. She placed one hand on the door. Though she had no intention of getting out, the object did not react to her presence. It did not turn toward the road or shine anything down. It simply remained above the field, large enough to cover a building and quiet enough to make the surrounding land feel abandoned. She watched for 2 or 3 minutes. The exact length was difficult to judge. Her eyes kept moving from one red point to the next, trying to understand whether they were attached to a solid surface or suspended in a dark shape she could not fully see. She never reached for her phone. The thought did not occur to her until much later. At the roadside, with the window open and the object above the field, recording it felt as distant an idea as calling someone from a dream. The triangle began to rise. It moved straight upward while remaining perfectly level. No corner lifted before another. There was no rotation, no sudden flash, and no visible force beneath it. The 3 red points stayed unchanged. As the object climbed, its outline became harder to separate from the sky. It did not shoot away. It faded upward, slowly, growing darker and smaller, until the stars returned around it. Then it was gone. Sound came back without warning. The engine hummed beneath the hood. Wind brushed against the open window. From the ditch came the faint rhythm of insects. The woman raised the glass and returned to the road. She arrived home near 2 a.m. The house was quiet. She placed leftovers in the microwave, sat at the kitchen table, and tried to decide whether she felt frightened. She did not. Not yet. Her body felt charged, as if she had taken too much caffeine. She replayed the rise over and over, seeing the object remain level as it disappeared into the dark. She went to bed, but never slept. At around 7:30 a.m., a black sedan was parked in her driveway. Its windows were heavily tinted. There were no license plates. 2 men stood outside. One waited near the front step. The other remained beside the car. Both wore dark suits. Neither displayed a badge. The woman opened the door but kept the storm door closed between them. The man near the house said they needed to ask a few questions. His voice was calm and professional. He gave no name and did not say who had sent him. He asked whether she had driven on County Road 700E during the night. She answered slowly. The man added another detail. Near the collapsed barn, she had not told anyone where she had stopped. She had not called the police, spoken to a coworker, or posted anything online. She asked how they knew. The man repeated his question. Had she noticed anything unusual? The woman said she had seen lights. She did not mention the triangle. The second man turned from the sedan. Do you often imagine things at night? He did not sound mocking. That was the unsettling part. He asked the question as though imagination were a medical condition she might honestly have forgotten to mention. The woman said no. The man by the steps asked what color the lights had been. She told him they were red. He wanted to know whether they moved. She said they rose. Neither man took notes. Neither appeared surprised. The second man looked past her toward the side of the house. Then he asked whether she had outdoor cameras. The woman said no. He answered with one word, understood. The interview ended immediately. The man near the door thanked her for her time. Both returned to the sedan. She watched through the front window as it backed out of the driveway. It did not stop at another house. It did not circle the block. It left the neighborhood and disappeared. Later that morning, the woman walked to the group mailbox shared by the cul-de-sac. A gray smear covered the front of her box. It looked greasy and felt cold despite the morning sun. None of the neighboring boxes had been touched. She cleaned it away with paper towels and dish soap. That evening, her dog refused to enter the backyard. The animal stopped at the open door and leaned backward against the leash. When she finally coaxed it outside, it stayed close to the house and stared upward. The dog did not bark. It watched. She checked the roof, the trees, and the sky above the yard. Nothing was there. The reasonable explanations came later. A large military aircraft may have crossed low over the fields. Darkness can hide wings and make separate lights appear connected. The radio and headlights may have reacted to an electrical fault unrelated to anything outside, but the object had made no sound. It had remained level while rising straight up, and before the woman had described a road, a barn, or a time, two strangers had arrived at the correct house and named the place for her. She still works late shifts. She still drives home in darkness. But County Road 700E is no longer part of the journey. The new route takes longer and passes more houses, brighter intersections, and a gas station that stays open through the night. She prefers the extra distance. The old barn is still there. She has seen it from other roads in daylight, its roof sinking a little farther each year. She has never returned after midnight. Sometimes, when her radio drops briefly between stations, she feels her hands tighten on the wheel. She waits for the headlights to dim. She watches for 3 dull red points above the fields, and she remembers how politely the men thanked her after learning there were no cameras. The accounts still ahead become less contained. The visitors do not always wait at the door. If you are still listening, whether closely or somewhere between waking and sleep, thank you for spending part of the night here. If these accounts are keeping you company, you can quietly like the video and subscribe so you do not miss the encounters still waiting here each day. And if you have ever seen something strange in the night sky or had someone ask about it afterward, you are welcome to share what happened in the comments. Our next account begins on a mountain trail in the Adirondacks, where the visitors did not wait at a door. Chapter 9. Replace your footage. The white Outback was already at the trailhead when the hiker arrived. It was parked alone near Indian Lake in the Adirondacks, its Vermont plates lightly coated with road dust. The lot held no other vehicles, and no driver stood nearby. The hiker lived about 3 hours south, near Poughkeepsie. He had driven up early in September, just after Labor Day weekend, hoping to complete the loop before the trails became busy. He parked at around 6:30 a.m. The outback looked locked and empty. No hiking pack rested against it. No coffee cup sat on the roof. There were no fresh footprints that he could clearly separate from older marks in the dirt. He assumed its owner had started before sunrise. The morning remained uneventful. The trail climbed through dense trees before turning across stretches of open rock. The air warmed slowly, but the forest floor stayed damp. He passed no one. By early afternoon, he was about 2/3 of the way through the loop. At around 1:30 p.m., he stopped to drink water near a break in the trees. That was when he saw the red lights. There were 3 of them, positioned just above the tallest trees about 100 yards away. Each appeared roughly the size of a dime, held at arm's length. They were too low to be aircraft. The lights blinked in a repeating rhythm. Though it matched no warning signal or navigation pattern he recognized. One flashed, then another, then the third. After a brief pause, the order began again. The sequence was deliberate. Nothing moved beneath them. No branches shook. No engine sounded beyond the ridge. The air between the hiker and the lights remained quiet. He took out his phone and began recording. The camera struggled to focus through the trees. It sharpened the nearest branches, then blurred the lights. When he tapped the screen, the red points became clearer for a second before softening again. The pattern continued. He adjusted his position, trying to find an open line between the trunks. The phone remained raised as he stepped to the side. Then he lowered it and looked at the screen. The lights were gone. He looked up. Nothing remained above the trees. He replayed the recording immediately. The clip showed brief red points between branches, but the focus shifted so often that the image was difficult to judge. Still, they were there. He saved the file and continued toward the trailhead. The forest felt different on the walk out, not silent, not empty, occupied. At first, he blamed the feeling on the lights. Once a person has seen something strange, every ordinary sound becomes attached to it. Then he began hearing footsteps. They remained several yards behind him, always slightly out of time with his own. When his right boot landed, another step followed a moment later. When he crossed loose stones, a softer movement came from the trees. He stopped. The second set stopped too. He waited, listening. A bird moved somewhere above him. Leaves shifted in a light breeze. No person appeared on the trail. He started again. The footsteps returned. They never came close enough to identify. They never moved ahead of him. They followed until the final descent toward the parking lot, then faded. He reached the trailhead just before 4 p.m. The white Outback remained in the same space. Its position had not changed. The windows looked dark, and the inside appeared empty. He had seen no one anywhere on the loop. He considered checking the vehicle, but decided against it. The hiker placed his pack in his own car and left. For the first part of the drive south, nothing followed him. Traffic increased as he joined Interstate 87. He settled into the long return trip, replaying the recording once at a stoplight, and again after pulling into a safe turnout. The red lights were faint but visible. Soon after returning to the highway, he noticed a black car in the mirror. The windows were deeply tinted. The license plate areas appeared blank. It remained several car lengths behind him. He reduced his speed. The car slowed. He accelerated. When the road opened, the distance between them stayed the same. That alone did not prove anything. Drivers often matched one another for long stretches without realizing it. The hiker changed lanes and allowed another vehicle to pass between them. The black car changed lanes as well. It followed for more than an hour. Near Ticonderoga, he left the interstate without planning where the exit would take him. The black car followed down the ramp. He turned onto a local road. It turned after him. He drove several miles, returned toward the interstate, and entered from another ramp. The car came back behind him. The hiker's fear did not arrive all at once. It grew through small confirmations. Every change he made was copied. Every attempt to lose the car failed. He eventually pulled into a roadside rest area with only a trash can, one picnic table, and a strip of cracked pavement. The black car stopped at the far end. Both engines shut down. No door open. For 10 minutes, the hiker sat with his hands on the wheel. He watched the other vehicle through the mirror, but the dark windshield revealed no movement. He considered calling the police. There was nothing clear to report. A car had followed him. Its driver had not threatened him, approached him, or broken any obvious law. He started his engine. The black car started too. He returned to the road. It full darkness had settled by the time he passed Albany. He left the main route again and stopped at a Sunoco station, off Route 9 near Kinderhook. The station was brightly lit and still open. He parked near the entrance and went inside to pay with cash, choosing a position where he could watch the lot through the windows. The black car pulled in. It stopped at the far end of the station. The hiker waited inside longer than necessary. He bought water, stood near a shelf, and watched the vehicle remain still. No one stepped out. At last, he returned to his car. The black car was no longer at the far end. It was parked directly beside him. The driver's window lowered. A man sat behind the wheel. He appeared to be in his late 40s. He was clean-shaven and wore a plain black ball cap with a dark zip-up hoodie. There was nothing official about his clothes. His face showed no anger, no smile either. He extended one hand through the window. A small black Universal cereal bus stick rested in his palm. "Replace your footage with this." The hiker did not move. The man repeated the words in the same tone. "Replace your footage with this." There was no explanation of which footage he meant. None was needed. The hiker took the stick. He later struggled to explain why. The station was open. Cameras likely covered the pumps. He could have stepped away or asked the clerk for help. Instead, he accepted it as if following a simple instruction. The man's window rose. The black car pulled out of the lot. Its lights disappeared onto Route 9. The hiker stood beside his car, holding the small device. He drove home without stopping again. The next morning, he connected the stick to a computer that was not linked to his personal accounts. It contained one file. The file was named vid.mp4. It ran for 10 minutes. The screen remained gray from beginning to end. Faint crackling played through the speakers. Every few seconds, a high-pitched tone sounded, similar to an old television powering up. There were no images, no voice, no visible message. He removed the stick and opened the recording from the hike. The file would not load. Its thumbnail had turned black. The phone described it as corrupt. Every other photograph and video on the device opened normally. Only the clip containing the 3 lights had failed. He tried copying it to a computer. The transfer stopped. He used recovery software, changed the file extension, and contacted someone familiar with damaged phone data. Nothing restored it. He did not replace the footage with the gray recording. He did not delete either file. The original remained on the phone as an unreadable black square. The 10-minute file remained on the stick. A week later, the hiker drove north again. He told himself he wanted to check whether the white Outback still occupied the trailhead. He had never seen its owner, and something about the unmoved vehicle continued to trouble him. When he reached the entrance road, he slowed. The Outback was gone. A different black car sat in the same parking space. It had no visible plates. The hiker did not enter the lot. He continued past the trailhead and kept driving until the road brought him back toward a busier town. He has not returned to Indian Lake. The universal serial bus stick remains stored away from his computer. He has played the gray file only a few times since that night. Nothing in it has changed. 10 minutes of empty color, a faint crackle, the same high tone returning again and again. His own recording has never opened. What remains is the memory of 3 red lights above the trees, a white Outback with no driver, and a black car that followed him across miles of highway to deliver a replacement for evidence that had not yet been destroyed. The instruction was simple: replace your footage. By the time he reached home, someone had already made sure there was almost nothing left to replace. Chapter 10. The Fire Ring. The stones had been arranged too perfectly to be accidental. At 6:12 a.m., the camper stood outside his tent at Site 12 in Ridge Hollow Campground, staring at the fire pit he had used the night before. The rough stones that had once formed an uneven ring were now spaced with exact gaps between them. Each one sat the same distance from the next. The circle looked measured, not repaired, not tidied by a careful groundskeeper. Drawn. The camper had arrived near the Allegheny front the previous afternoon, carrying enough food and firewood for a quiet mid-October weekend. His tent stood a few hundred yards from the gravel lot, separated from the other sites by bare trees and sloping ground. The temperature had fallen into the low 40s overnight. His first evening had been ordinary. He cooked ramen over the fire, read several chapters of a paperback, and listened to wind move through branches that had already lost most of their leaves. Before sleeping, he poured water over the coals. The stones around the pit had been irregular. Some touched, others sat several inches apart. One larger rock leaned inward where the soil beneath it had worn away. He remembered that clearly because he had used the leaning stone to balance his cooking pot. Now every rock sat upright, uniform gaps, equal spacing. A nearly flawless circle around cold ash. He searched the ground for footprints. The soil held marks from his own boots, but nothing approached the pit from the woods. Fallen leaves remained undisturbed around the site. No animal tracks crossed them. The camper spent a full minute trying to persuade himself that he had rearranged the stones and forgotten. He had not been drinking. He had taken no sleep medication. He remembered extinguishing the fire, entering the tent, and waking once during the night when wind pressed against the fabric. He had never touched the rocks. He removed his Canon point-and-shoot camera from the pack. The campground had no phone service, but he checked the time out of habit before taking one photograph. 6:12 a.m. The image showed the full circle, the ash at its center, and the lower edge of his tent beyond it. He reviewed the picture once. It looked ordinary enough. A neat fire ring in the early morning light. Only he knew it had not looked that way before he slept. After breakfast, the camper left the site for a 5-mile loop along the Red Blaze Trail. The path rose through hardwood forest before bending toward a narrow ridge. He carried the camera inside his pack. It had not been out since the photograph. About 30 minutes into the hike, he saw someone standing off the trail. The man was positioned several yards ahead, partly hidden by two bear trunks. At first, the camper assumed he was a ranger or a private security worker. The uniform was black and cut in a plain, official style. There was no name tag, no patch, no agency marking. The clothing looked freshly pressed, too clean and crisp for someone who had walked through damp leaves and soft ground to reach that spot. The man stepped onto the trail. He asked whether the camper was alone. There was no greeting before the question. The camper said there were other people somewhere in the campground, though he had not seen anyone since arriving. The man looked past him, in the direction of Site 12. Then he asked to see the camera. The camper did not answer at first. The camera had remained inside the pack. He had never raised it on the trail. He had not mentioned it to anyone. And the campground registration did not ask what equipment he carried. The man repeated the request. His voice was calm, not threatening, almost bored. The camper removed the cannon and handed it over. The man did not turn it on. He did not open the image gallery or press any button. He placed the camera flat in his palm and turned it over once, studying the casing rather than the photograph stored inside. Then he handed it back. "Please, don't take pictures of the fire rings. That's all." The camper held the camera against his chest. He asked what the man meant. The stranger stepped off the trail. There was a steep slope on that side, covered in wet leaves and loose soil. The camper expected him to move carefully or reach for a tree. He did neither. He took several steady steps downhill and passed behind a thick trunk. The camper moved forward to keep him in sight. No one was there. The slope continued for hundreds of feet. There was no side path, no structure, and no place where a man in a black uniform could have disappeared so quickly. The camper listened for leaves moving below. Nothing. He considered ending the hike immediately. Instead, he continued the loop, telling himself the man had known the woods and taken a route he could not see. The explanation became less convincing with every mile. When he returned to the campsite, the stone circle remained unchanged. He checked the camera. The photograph opened normally. The image still showed the measured ring and around the ash. He looked through the rest of the memory card. Photographs from previous trips appeared as expected. Mountain views, old buildings, friends around other campfires. Nothing seemed damaged. The camper placed the camera inside his tent and prepared dinner. An hour later, he checked it again. The thumbnail for the fire ring had turned black. He selected the file. The camera displayed an error and refused to open it. Every other image remained intact. He removed the card and inserted it again. The same black square appeared in the gallery. The file existed, but the photograph inside it was gone. Darkness reached the campground early. The camper built a smaller fire and stayed close to it. He watched the trees more than the flames. No light appeared between the trunks, and no person crossed the sides. Before entering the tent, he examined the stones once more. The gaps were still even. The circle was still perfect. He left the camera switched off beside his sleeping bag. Sometime after midnight, footsteps moved outside the tent. They began behind him. Slow pressure against leaves. One step, then another. The sound traveled around the tent in a broad circle. The camper sat up. The footsteps stopped. He remained still, waiting for an animal to sniff at the fabric or move away. Nothing followed. After several minutes, he lay down. The steps returned. They continued around the tent, never coming close enough to touch it. Each time the camper lifted his head or shifted his weight, the sound faded. When he relaxed, it began again. He did not leave the tent. He kept the flashlight in one hand until pale morning light reached the fabric. The campsite looked empty when he finally stepped outside. No footprints surrounded the tent. The fire pit had changed again. The stones no longer formed a circle. They had been placed in a long, deliberate arc, beginning beside the ashes and curving away from the pit. The spacing remained precise. The shape narrowed as it entered the leaves, like a tail. The camper did not photograph it. He did not move a single rock. He packed quickly, leaving breakfast untouched, and the tent damp with morning condensation. Before walking back toward the gravel lot, he looked once at the arc leading away from the fire, a shape left behind. There were no lights above the trees, no craft crossing the ridge, no strange sound beyond the footsteps he had heard through the tent. Only the stones, only the photograph that would no longer open. Only a man in a spotless uniform who knew about the camera and the fire ring before the camper had spoken of either. Ridge Hollow Campground remains open. Site 12 is still listed among its ordinary campsites. The camper has visited other parks since that weekend, but never alone. He chooses busy grounds now, places where tents stand close together and voices carry after dark. He still owns the Canon camera. The damage file remains on the memory card as a black thumbnail. It has never opened, and he has never deleted it. Sometimes he wonders whether the first circle was meant to mark the fire pit, or whether the final arc was pointing away from it. He has never returned to find out. Chapter 11. The Drone That Never Came Home. The first strange thing appeared for less than a tenth of a second. The drone pilot did not notice it while filming. He found it later, pausing the video frame by frame and searching for the reason the camera had briefly flashed. 2 frames showed something metallic crossing the image. No wings, no curve in its path, just a thin chrome-like blur passing from one side of the desert sky to the other. He lived near Yuma, Arizona, where open land and clear weather made flying drones easy. He treated it as a serious hobby, planning routes carefully and staying away from restricted airspace. That afternoon, he parked at a gravel pull-off just off the Highway 95, near the eastern edge of the Yuma Proving Ground. The location was outside the restricted zone, a boundary he had always respected. The sky was cloudless. Heat rose from the ground in faint waves, and the late sun turned the desert a pale gold. At around 4:20 p.m., he placed his DJI Mavic 3 Pro on the bed of his truck and launched it. His plan was simple. He wanted a slow sunset time-lapse looking across the empty land. The drone would climb, hold position, and record the light changing over the distant ridges. The flight began normally. The controller showed a strong connection. The battery was full. Wind remained light enough for stable footage. He flew several wide passes, then brought the drone back toward the truck to review the angle. That was when he noticed the brief flash in the recording. He replayed the section. The metallic blur crossed too quickly to study at normal speed. When he slowed the footage, it appeared in only 2 frames. The shape did not seem round. It looked narrow and straight, like a piece of polished metal moving across the camera. He assumed it was an insect close to the lens. The explanation fit the speed, but not the reflection. Insects usually crossed as dark smears or soft shapes. This object flashed brightly, as though sunlight had struck a smooth metal surface. He raised the drone again. A few minutes later, he saw the shape with his own eyes. It moved low over the desert, several hundred yards from the pull-off. The object was thin and dark, perhaps 10 to 15 feet long. There were no wings, no visible lights, and no trail behind it. It crossed from left to right in a perfectly straight line, moving too quickly for him to follow with the camera. Then it appeared again from another direction. The second pass was lower. The shape traveled across the open ground, changed its angle beyond the edge of his view, and returned on another straight path. It did not bank like an aircraft. It did not curve through a turn. Each pass looked separate, as though the object were tracing clean lines across the desert, circling, measuring, scanning. The drone pilot stood beside the truck, with the controller held against his chest. He could hear nothing from the object. The drone itself produced a familiar high buzz overhead, but beyond it, the desert remained quiet. No engine crossed the distance. No jet noise arrived several seconds later. The dark shape made one final pass. Then it vanished. It did not shrink toward the horizon. It did not descend behind a ridge. The object occupied one part of the sky, and then that part was empty. The pilot decided to climb the drone for a top-down view. If the object remained low, a higher angle might reveal where it had gone. He pushed the controls forward and watched the altitude increase. The connection failed. There was no gradual loss of signal. The strength indicator did not weaken 1 bar at a time. The feed cut instantly. The screen turned black. He released the controls and waited for the automatic return to home system to take over. The drone was programmed to fly back to its launch point. When communication failed, nothing happened. The map did not update. The location marker froze. He tried reconnecting. The controller powered itself down. Its battery had shown 74%. He pressed the power button once, then again. The screen remained dark. Above him, the drone was gone. He listened for the sound of a crash. A drone falling from that height should have struck hard enough to hear on open desert ground. There was no impact, no breaking plastic, and no cloud of dust. He climbed onto the truck bed and scanned the sky. Nothing moved. The sudden quiet felt personal. For several minutes he had carried the strong sense that something was watching his flight. Standing there with the controller dead in his hands, he felt that attention lift. Whatever had been looking at him had stopped. He searched until the light began to fade. The drone's last recorded position led him across rough ground, but there was no wreckage. He found no battery, propeller, broken casing, or mark in the dirt. He returned home by 8:45 p.m. The dead controller and the remaining equipment went into a hard case. He placed the case beneath the tonneau cover over the truck bed and locked everything before going inside. He planned to search again in the morning. At around 10:30 p.m., someone knocked on his front door. 3 slow knocks. The porch light had been broken for months, leaving the walkway in darkness. He looked through the window before opening the door. A man stood outside. He wore a black suit, a white shirt, and a plain black tie. His hair was slicked back neatly. His face was so average that the pilot later found it difficult to describe. Not young, not old, nothing memorable, except the stillness. The pilot opened the door only a few inches. The man looked at him. "You misunderstood the sky." His tone was calm. The pilot asked what he meant. The stranger gave a small smile that never reached his eyes. "Let's keep it that way." He turned and walked down the gravel path. The pilot watched his shoes. There was no dust on them. The man crossed the walkway and continued into the dark beyond the property. No car started. No headlights appeared. No taillights moved away along the road. The pilot remained at the door, listening. Nothing. The next morning, he went directly to the truck. The tonneau cover was still locked. There were no scratches around the latch, and no marks suggesting anyone had forced it open. He unlocked the cover and reached for the hard case. It was where he had left it. The zipper pulls remained together. The case looked untouched. Inside, the molded foam was empty. The drone and controller were gone. He checked beneath the truck bed, behind the seats, and throughout the garage, though he knew he had placed both devices inside the case. Nothing else was missing. Someone had opened a locked truck cover, removed equipment from a zipped case, closed everything, and left no visible sign of entry. The doorbell camera should have recorded the driveway. The pilot opened the footage. At 3:12 a.m., the image froze. It remained fixed for 33 minutes. No timestamp advance. No headlights crossed the frame. No shadow moved near the truck. At 3:45 a.m., the recording resumed. The camera had never produced such a gap before. It worked normally through the rest of the night. The nearby proving ground offered an obvious explanation for the object. Classified aircraft are tested in the Arizona desert, and some may use designs or speeds unfamiliar to the public. But secret testing does not explain the visitor. It does not explain the dustless shoes on a gravel path, and it does not explain equipment disappearing from a locked case without leaving a mark. The pilot filed no report. He imagined trying to describe the missing drone to the police. He would have to explain the metallic shape, the failed signal, the man at the door, and a case that remained locked after its contents vanished. He believed the story would sound less believable each time he added a true detail. The empty case stayed with him. He kept it in the garage long after replacing the other equipment. The shaped spaces in the foam remained clean, holding the outline of the drone and controller that had once rested there. He stopped flying for a long time. When he eventually returned to the hobby, he chose crowded parks and open recreational areas far from restricted land. He watched the signal meter more closely and kept every recording backed up in several places. He never returned to the pull-off near Highway 95. The official boundary had always mattered to him. He had remained outside it. After that day, he understood that the line on a map might not have been the boundary that mattered. He had not entered their airspace. Something from it had entered his. And before leaving, it had taken back every physical record of the mistake. Chapter 12. The shape that rose from the lake. The lake was almost black beneath the October sky. Mallory and her boyfriend had come to Deep Creek Lake during the off-season, when summer visitors were gone and many of the nearby rentals had been closed for the year. They were staying at a roadside motel a few miles from the state park entrance, in a room that smelled faintly of old carpet and electric heat. The quiet was what they had wanted. At around 11 p.m., they drove to an unlit gravel boat launch at the north end of the lake. The air was cold, though not yet freezing. They sat together on the hood of the car with a thermos between them, watching the stars above the water. No boats moved across the lake. No houses were visible along the far shore. For a while, they spoke quietly and listened to the small sounds of water touching the launch. Mallory noticed the mist first. A pale patch seemed to be forming near the middle of the lake. It was too far away to study clearly, and at first it looked like ordinary fog rising from warmer water into cold night air. Then it began moving upward. The mist did not spread across the surface. It gathered in one place and lifted, as though something beneath it were pushing through. Both of them sat upright. A shape rose from the water. It was massive and angular, like a long wedge with a flat underside. The front narrowed slightly while the rear widened into a broad, dark edge. No windows or markings were visible. There were no lights. The object lifted straight upward with slow, steady control. Water should have poured from its surface. There should have been a splash, a rush, or the heavy sound of something large breaking free from the lake. They heard none of it. The shape climbed in complete silence. It stopped at roughly 50 feet above the surface. For several seconds, it hovered there. The water below remained strangely calm. There were no wide ripples moving toward shore, and no foam where the object had emerged. The lake looked untouched. Mallory reached for her boyfriend's arm. Neither of them spoke. The object was large enough to appear clearly against the far tree line. Its flat underside remained darker than the sky behind it, but the edges were difficult to hold in focus. Looking directly at one section made another seem less certain. Then it moved sideways. The wedge glided low above the lake, staying almost perfectly level. It passed in front of the distant trees, making its true size even harder to dismiss. There was no engine sound, no air moving over the water, no visible force keeping it above the surface. The shape continued toward the darker end of the lake until its outline blended into the night. It did not accelerate. It did not rise. It simply became harder to see. Then it was gone. For several moments, the couple remained on the hood. Mallory finally asked whether he had seen the same thing. He said yes. Neither tried to name it. They climbed down and returned to the car. As they approached the driver's side, Mallory noticed a folded piece of paper beneath the windshield wiper. It had not been there when they arrived. The gravel lot was open enough that they would have seen anyone walking toward the vehicle. No headlights had entered the launch. No footsteps had sounded behind them. Her boyfriend removed the note. Inside, 4 words had been printed in block capitals. "Keep driving next time." They searched the lot with a flashlight. No one stood near the trees or the launch. The gravel around the car showed only their own tracks. Mallory wanted to leave immediately. They drove back to the motel without turning on the radio. The note stayed on the center console between them, folded closed. Neither slept much. Each time a vehicle passed on the main road, its headlights moved across the motel room wall. Each time, they both looked toward the window. Before daylight, Mallory went to the lobby for coffee. A man sat in a chair beside the fake fireplace. He wore a black suit with a dark tie. His hands were pale where they held a newspaper in front of him. Sunglasses covered his eyes, though the sun had not yet risen. The newspaper was upside down. Mallory noticed it immediately. The man turned one page, then another. He made no attempt to correct the paper. He appeared to be reading it, moving through the pages at a calm, steady pace. Mallory filled a cup and returned to the room. She told her boyfriend about the man, but neither wanted to walk back into the lobby simply to look at him. By checkout, daylight had reached the parking lot. The man was still there. He lowered the newspaper as Mallory approached the desk. The sunglasses remained on his face. He did not speak. When she completed the checkout, he stood. Mallory walked outside. The man followed. He stopped near the motel entrance and watched her cross the lot. His expression did not change. He did not look toward her boyfriend or toward any other guest. His attention remained on Mallory until she entered the car. Then he stayed where he was. No wave, no warning, only the stare. They pulled onto the road and drove away. Several miles passed before either of them spoke. Her boyfriend remembered the dash cam. It had been running when they entered the gravel lot. If the object had risen from the lake, within the camera's view, the recording might have captured something. They stopped later and checked the footage. The drive toward the boat launch was there. The final turn appeared normally. The camera recorded the gravel lot, the headlights, and the moment the vehicle stopped. The timestamp continued. Then the image turned black. There was no sound. For the next 2 hours, the file held nothing but darkness. The recording had not been deleted. The missing time remained inside it, minute after minute, as a black screen with no audio. Then the picture returned. The camera showed the car leaving the launch. The note under the wiper was not visible from its angle. The lake was behind them. Nothing appeared in the road. The recording continued normally for the entire drive back to the motel. They checked the camera settings and memory card. No other file contained a similar failure. The device had not shut down. It had continued counting time while recording nothing. 2 hours of dead air. Her boyfriend kept the note. It remains folded inside the glove compartment of his car. The paper has softened along the creases, but the printed message is still easy to read. They have not returned to that launch. Their later trips became shorter and busier, planned around daylight and places where other people would be nearby. Mallory no longer enjoyed isolated lake roads after dark. What rose from Deep Creek Lake left no visible mark on the water. What followed them to the motel offered no name. The only physical thing they carried away was a note telling them what they should have done. Keep driving. The next account also belongs to a pilot. But the object beside his aircraft was not the detail that finally kept him on the ground. It was what two strangers said after every record of his report had disappeared. Chapter 13. The nickname, No Record, holds. Mr. Wilcox had been flying for more than 30 years. By the evening, the object appeared beside his aircraft. He was not a man who treated the sky carelessly. He checked weather twice, walked around the plane before every flight, and preferred routine over risk. The 1974 Piper Cherokee he shared with his flying club friend Pete was old, but well-maintained and familiar in every sound it made. The plane was kept in a shared hangar near Missoula, Montana. A little after 7 p.m., Wilcox lifted off from the municipal strip outside the city. He planned a simple visual flight east toward the Bitterroot Mountains, then a broad loop back before the last light faded. The weather was calm. Scattered clouds rested high above the ridges. There was no turbulence, and visibility stretched for miles. The Cherokee held steady as the land below changed from roads and rooftops to darker stretches of forest and open ground. About 20 minutes into the flight, near Rock Creek, Wilcox noticed something off his left wing. At first, he thought it was another aircraft approaching from the side. The object was roughly 200 feet away, close enough that he expected to see wings or navigation lights. Instead, he saw a perfectly round metallic shape, like a coin held edge on. It had no visible markings, no cockpit, no exhaust. The surface caught the fading evening light in a dull silver line. Wilcox checked his instruments, then looked back. The object was still there. It paced the Cherokee in parallel. There was no sign that it was being pushed by wind. It did not rise or fall with the small movements of the air. Its position remained fixed beside him, matching his speed without any visible means of flight. Wilcox adjusted the throttle slightly. The object stayed with him. He changed his heading by a few degrees. It followed. For about 15 seconds, the two shapes crossed the sky together. One was a small aircraft with an engine, wings, controls, surfaces, and a pilot who understood how each movement was made. The other showed none of those things. Wilcox reached for the radio. Before he could complete the call, the object moved. It shot upward into the clouds. There was no curve to the climb, no slow increase in speed. It rose at an angle so steep and so fast that Wilcox lost sight of it almost immediately. The clouds closed over the metallic shape. Nothing emerged above them. Wilcox called air traffic control and reported an unknown object near his position. The controller checked the area. There was no traffic near him. No primary radar contact appeared in his vicinity. Primary radar can sometimes detect an object even when it carries no identifying signal, yet the screen showed nothing beside the Cherokee. Wilcox gave his location again. The answer remained the same. Empty airspace. He completed the loop and returned to the airport. After landing, he filed a routine written report describing a possible unauthorized aircraft. His language was careful. He listed the time, position, distance, shape, and direction of travel. He did not write the word alien. He did not claim to know what he had seen. The report stated only that an unidentified metallic object had paced his aircraft and then climbed into cloud at a speed he could not explain. Wilcox expected a follow-up. None came. A week passed, then another. When he checked the online system, the report was gone. There was no note saying it had been reviewed or closed, no edit trail, no record that it had ever been submitted. Wilcox went to the hangar cabinet where paper copies of reports and weekly records were stored. His copy was missing. So was the entire folder for that week. Pete had not moved it. No one else in the flying club remembered removing anything from the cabinet. Wilcox contacted the Federal Aviation Administration field office. The employee who answered searched the flight record and said no report was attached to it. Wilcox gave the date, the aircraft registration, and the route. The result did not change. No report existed. The employee suggested that he might be misremembering whether he had completed the submission. Wilcox ended the call without arguing. He knew what he had done. 3 weeks after the sighting, he arrived at the hangar early on a Sunday morning. The wind was strong enough to pull at his jacket. The airport was nearly empty, and most of the hangar doors were still closed. A long black car was parked near the row of buildings. 2 men stood beside it. They wore black suits with no coats. Though the morning was cold, they appeared to be the same age and carried the same narrow build, as their hair was cut in the same plain style. When Wilcox opened the hangar door, both men began walking toward him. They moved at the same pace. The taller one greeted him by name. He said they were following up on his report of a visual anomaly. Wilcox asked who they worked for. The man gave a small, patient smile. "We handle misfiled data." The second man remained silent. Wilcox told them the report had vanished. The taller man said that was why they had come. Their questions did not begin with the shape of the object. They asked whether Wilcox had experienced dizziness after the flight, confusion, loss of time, auditory hallucinations. Wilcox answered no to each one. He said he had remained alert throughout the encounter and remembered every part of the flight. The second man watched his face closely while he spoke. Then the taller man asked whether he had heard voices over the radio that did not belong to air traffic control. Wilcox said no. Had he noticed any change in sleep? No. Any repeated dreams? No. Any fear of returning to the aircraft? Wilcox hesitated before answering. That hesitation seemed to interest them. The taller man said a short leave from flying might be wise. Wilcox told him no medical complaint had been filed, and no one had questioned his license. The man nodded. Not yet. The words were quiet. There was no open threat in them, only the calm suggestion that one could be created if necessary. Wilcox asked whether they had removed the report. Neither man answered. He asked how they knew about it if the Federal Aviation Administration had no record. Again, silence. The men turned toward the car. Wilcox remained by the hangar, watching them go. Near the vehicle, the taller man looked back. Still chasing the sky, huh, Chippy? Wilcox stopped breathing for a moment. Chippy. No record anywhere held that name. His late grandfather had called him Chippy when he was a child. No teacher had used it. No friend knew it. It did not appear in old letters, licenses, flight records, emails, or social media. Wilcox had never told Pete. He had never told his wife. The nickname belonged to a small part of childhood that had died with his grandfather. Yet the stranger spoke it casually, as though continuing an old conversation. The two men walked across the gravel. Their shoes made no sound. Wilcox heard the wind against the hangar. He heard a loose piece of metal tapping somewhere along the roof. He heard his own breathing return, but no gravel shifted beneath their steps. The men entered the car. It drove away without hurry. That evening, Wilcox searched every place where a copy of the report might remain. His sent emails contained nothing. The notes he had typed after landing were gone. His cloud storage showed no earlier version. A local copy remained on his laptop under the original file name. When he opened it, the document was blank. Not deleted, overwritten. The name of the file remained, but every word inside had been removed. Pete called him the following evening. A long, black car was idling near the tree line, down the road from the hangars. Pete could not see who was inside. The car remained there for several minutes, then left. Wilcox did not fly again. At first, he told himself the pause would be temporary. A few weeks to think, a little time away from the airport. The weeks became months. The Cherokee remained in the hangar until Pete finally bought out his share. Wilcox had spent more than 30 years trusting the sky. He understood weather, distance, machinery, and the limits of human sight. The metallic object disturbed him, but it was still something he could place inside a question. The visitors were different. They had found a report that no longer existed. They knew what he had seen. They knew what questions to ask, and one of them knew a name that belonged to no file on Earth. For Wilcox, that was the detail that ended his time in the air. Not the object beside the wing, not the climb into the clouds. One word spoken on gravel. Chippy, Chapter 14. The reset at 7:14. At 7:14 a.m., the phone erased itself. That was the time later found in its system record. A hard factory. Reset had been carried out at exactly 7:14 on a quiet morning in Riverton, Wyoming. The owner had not selected the command. He had not entered his passcode. He had not even felt the phone return to his pocket. To understand why that time mattered, the story has to begin several hours earlier, on County Road 221, about 30 miles east of Lander. The witness had once worked outdoors for a living and was comfortable alone in remote places. During the Perseid meteor shower 2 summers earlier, he drove into open country to photograph the night sky away from town lights. He arrived before 11 p.m. There was no phone service on that stretch of road. No houses were visible. Low hills and scrub brush surrounded the pull-off, and the nearest artificial light came from his own truck. He set a tripod in the truck bed and aimed the camera toward the darkest part of the sky. For several hours, the night behaved as expected. Meteors crossed in brief white lines. Some were too fast for the camera. Others remained bright, but long enough to leave faint trails in longer exposures. The air cooled after midnight. He wore a jacket, drank coffee from a thermos, and moved between the camera and the cab. Occasionally, a vehicle passed far away on another road, but none came near him. Sometime after 3 a.m., he climbed down from the truck bed to change a battery. When he turned toward the road, someone was standing behind his vehicle. The figure occupied the exact center of the lane about 50 feet away. It had not approached with headlights. No engine had sounded. There had been no crunch of footsteps over gravel. One moment, the road had been empty. Now, it was not. The meteor watcher remained beside the truck. The figure was tall and thin, though darkness hid its clothing and face. Its arms hung low along its sides. It did not wave or call out. He switched on his headlamp. The beam reached the road clearly. Pale gravel appeared beneath it. Brush lit up on both shoulders. The light should have fallen across the figure's head and upper body. It did not reveal a face. The shape remained dark inside the beam. The meteor watcher adjusted the lamp and looked directly toward it. The figure did not raise a hand or turn away from the brightness. It did not shield its eyes. It did not move at all. He called out, asking whether the person needed help. No answer came. For several seconds, they faced one another across the road. The witness later admitted that he felt afraid, but not because the figure threatened him. The fear came from how completely it refused to behave like someone standing in a bright light on an empty road. He reached for the camera. The tripod remained in the truck bed, so he used the phone in his pocket instead. He opened the camera and raised it. The figure stayed still. He pressed the shutter once. At the exact click of the photograph, the figure turned. It walked away from the road and disappeared behind the slope. There was no rush in its movement, no reaction to being photographed. It simply turned, crossed the shoulder, and entered the darkness beyond the hill. The witness ran several steps toward the place where it had vanished. His headlamp swept across brush, loose stones, and empty ground. No person was visible. The slope offered no path wide enough for someone to disappear that quickly without sound. He returned to the truck and opened the photograph. The image was dark, but the figure appeared clearly enough to examine. It looked taller than he remembered. The body was thin and covered in black. The arms seemed too long, reaching farther down the sides than they should have. The head was the most difficult part to understand. Its shape looked slightly wrong, narrow in one place and broad in another. There were no visible features, no clear eyes, mouth, or nose. A camera artifact could explain some of it. Low light can stretch edges. Digital noise can remove detail and turn an ordinary person into something distorted. But the photograph existed, and the person in it had arrived without a car, stood inside the headlamp beam without showing a face, and left without producing a single footstep. The meteor watcher packed immediately. He removed the camera from the tripod, closed the truck bed, and drove toward Riverton. The photograph remained on his phone. He checked it twice during the drive. Once, after pulling safely to the side of the road. The file opened both times. Near 7 a.m., he stopped at a Conoco station in Riverton. The store was almost empty. A cashier stood behind the counter, and no other customers were visible. The witness entered the bathroom. He had barely reached the sink when the door opened behind him. A man stepped inside. He wore a black suit and a white shirt buttoned all the way to the top. His skin was pale. His shoes were spotless, without dust, moisture, or the small marks that collect on anyone walking through a gas station parking lot. His eyes did not match. One appeared darker than the other, though the witness could not tell whether the difference came from color, reflection, or something deeper in the face. The man looked directly at him. "You've seen too much light lately." The meteor watcher turned toward the door. The stranger remained between him and the exit. There was no anger in his posture. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the calm certainty of someone asking for an item that already belonged to him. "Your phone?" The witness asked who he was. The man extended one hand. "You took a picture. Give me the device." The meteor watcher reached into his pocket. Later, he could not explain why he obeyed. He was larger than the stranger. The store was open beyond the door. A cashier stood only a short distance away, yet the request felt less like a choice than an action already underway. He placed the phone in the man's hand. The stranger entered the passcode. The meteor watcher had never said it aloud. He had not unlocked the phone in front of the man. The stranger moved through the screen quickly, then turned and left the bathroom. The witness followed only seconds later. The store was empty except for the cashier. No black suit crossed the aisles. No one stood near the exit. The meteor watcher asked whether a man had just walked out. The cashier said no one had entered since he arrived. The witness reached for his phone. It was already in his pocket. He had not felt anyone place it there. He pulled it out and pressed the power button. The setup screen appeared. The phone had returned to factory condition. Photographs, messages, contacts, and applications were gone. The image from County Road 221 had vanished with everything else. He checked the parking lot. No unfamiliar vehicle was leaving. No man crossed the pumps. Morning traffic moved along the road in both directions. The witness took the phone to a repair shop and later tried recovery software himself. Nothing was found. The device held no deleted photographs, no damaged copy, and no trace of the image. Only the reset record remained. It showed a hard factory wipe performed at 7:14 a.m. Those were the exact minutes he had spent in the gas station bathroom. The meteor watcher still visits remote areas during meteor showers, but he no longer goes alone. He keeps more than one camera with him and makes backups as soon as possible. He has never returned to County Road 221. The photograph exists only in memory now. A narrow figure in black, arms too long, a featureless head turned toward the light, and a stranger the following morning who knew the picture had been taken before the witness had shown it to anyone. The phone could be reset. The road could be avoided. But 7:14 remained in the system record, marking the precise moment someone took the evidence from his hand and returned the device empty. Chapter 15. You're back early. Paul Donovan opened his eyes at 5:47 a.m. and did not know where he was. The windshield in front of him had fogged from the inside. Pale morning light filtered through the glass, revealing dust across the dashboard and the dark outline of scrub brush beyond the hood. He was sitting behind the wheel of his own car. The engine was off. The road beneath him was unpaved. For several seconds, Paul remained still and waited for memory to return. He expected some simple explanation to rise into place. A wrong turn, a decision to stop and sleep, a late change of plans. He had been too tired to remember clearly. Nothing came. The previous evening had begun in Flagstaff, Arizona. Paul was 32 and traveling for work. He had finished a client meeting at around 8 p.m. and planned to spend the night near Winslow. Under normal conditions, the drive should have taken roughly 2 hours. The weather was clear and cold. Stars filled the northern Arizona sky, and traffic thinned as he left the city behind. Paul remembered feeling tired after the workday, but not sleepy. He had eaten, carried water in the car, and felt alert enough to continue. His last clear memory was a brief gas stop at around 10:30 p.m. somewhere near Flagstaff. He remembered standing beneath bright station lights. He remembered the smell of fuel. He remembered getting back into the car. After that, there was nothing. No image of the highway, no memory of leaving the main road, no moment when he chose to stop. The next thing he knew, dawn was forming over an unfamiliar dirt road. Paul wiped the windshield with his sleeve and looked outside. There were no signs, no houses, no streetlights. Low hills rose beyond the brush, but he could not identify them. He checked his phone. There was no signal. The battery still held a charge, though the map would not load without service. The clock confirmed the time, 5:47 a.m. More than 7 hours had passed since the gas stop. Paul stepped out of the car. The cold air helped clear his head, but it did nothing for the missing time. He walked around the vehicle, expecting damage. There was none. No dented panel, no broken light, no scrape beneath the doors. The tires looked normal. The windows were intact. Nothing suggested he had left the road by accident or struck anything in the dark. He checked himself next. His clothes were in place. His wallet, keys, and work bag were still with him. There was no blood, no bruise he could find, and no pain beyond the stiffness of sleeping upright. The fuel gauge showed half a tank. Paul stared at it. He did not remember filling the tank after the last stop. He could not recall how much fuel had been there before, but the car had clearly traveled farther than the short stretch he remembered driving. He sat inside again and tried to start the engine. It turned over normally. The radio came on at low volume. The dashboard showed no warning light. The steering and brakes responded as they should. Paul drove slowly along the dirt road, hoping it would lead toward a marked route. After several minutes, the road narrowed. Deep ruts crossed the surface, and the surrounding brush grew thicker. He worried that continuing might leave him trapped farther from help. He stopped and returned on foot. About 1 mile later, he reached a paved road. There was no traffic. He chose east because the morning sun gave him a direction, though he had no idea what waited ahead. The walk felt longer than it was. Every few minutes he checked the phone for a signal. None appeared. Eventually, a low building came into view. A sign identified it as the Desert Pines Lodge. The motel stood about 10 miles from Winslow, but on the opposite side from the route Paul believed he had been following. Somehow, during the missing hours, he had crossed onto back roads and ended up in a place he had never intended to visit. The clerk looked tired when Paul entered. Paul asked whether anyone had come through during the night. The clerk shook his head. No late guests, no one asking for directions, no one reporting a stranded car. Paul rented a room. He showered, changed his shirt, and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the television. The missing hours did not feel hidden behind fog or confusion. They felt absent, a blank wall in his mind. Around 9 a.m., someone knocked on the door. Paul assumed it was the clerk. When he opened it, a man stood in the walkway. He wore a black suit and tie beneath a long black coat. His dark hair had been combed neatly away from his face. His expression revealed nothing. The man looked directly at Paul. "You're back early." Paul did not answer. The stranger had not asked his name. He had not checked the room number or explained why he was there. He had simply spoken, as though Paul had returned from an expected journey. Paul opened the door farther. The man stepped back. Then he was gone. There were no footsteps moving down the walkway. No nearby door opened or closed. No vehicle started in the parking lot. Paul stepped outside. The path ran clearly in both directions. The motel office stood at one end, and an open stretch of gravel lay at the other. No one was there. The disappearance had taken only seconds. Paul checked behind the stairwell and around the corner of the building. He found empty pavement, parked cars, and morning light. Nothing else. He returned to the room and locked the door. Later that day, Paul began checking what could be checked. His office confirmed that the client had seen him leave Flagstaff at around 8 p.m. No one had spoken to him. After that, his phone's location history showed a normal route toward Winslow until around 10:30 p.m. Then the record stopped. The gap continued until roughly 5:30 a.m. After that, the phone showed movement through a network of back roads leading toward the place where Paul had awakened. The route existed. He simply had no memory of driving it. A mechanic inspected the car. The brakes worked. The steering was sound. The engine showed no fault that might have forced Paul from the highway. There was no sign of a collision, electrical failure, or repair carried out during the night. Fatigue can damage memory. A person can drive while exhausted, lose track of familiar stretches of road, or wake after an unintended sleep episode with only fragments of what came before. Paul accepts that possibility, but it does not explain everything. It does not explain how he completed miles of unfamiliar back roads without damaging the car. It does not explain the fuel he could not remember buying. And it does not explain why a stranger appeared at a motel Paul had never planned to visit and spoke as though Paul had returned sooner than expected. He never recovered a single image from the missing hours. No headlights, no voice, no turn from the highway. Nothing. Paul still travels for work, but he avoids long drives after dark whenever possible. When he must take them, he keeps the radio on and stops before tiredness settles too deeply. Quiet side roads trouble him now, not because he remembers something happening there, because he remembers nothing at all. And whenever a road becomes empty beneath a wide night sky, the stranger's words return with perfect clarity. You're back early. Chapter 16. The Men Who Cast No Shadows. At exactly 3:02 a.m., a black sedan entered the perimeter camera's frame without headlights. The contract security guard leaned closer to the monitor. He worked overnight surveillance for a private contractor near a military base outside Hawthorne, Nevada. His shift ran from midnight until 8 a.m., most of it spent in a dim control room watching empty roads, locked gates, fencing, and stretches of desert where almost nothing moved. The work was built around a repetition. A distant patrol vehicle crossed one screen every hour. Wind pushed dust over another. Small animals sometimes triggered motion alerts near the outer fence. The camera showing the sedan covered a road about half a mile from the main gates. Vehicles occasionally used it during the day. At 3:02 in the morning, it should have been empty. The sedan appeared to be from the late 1990s or early 2000s. Its body was long and dark, with a shape common enough to look ordinary from a distance. But the lights were off. No headlights, no parking lamps. The car moved through the darkness until it reached the center of the frame, then stopped. The guard checked the other feeds. No second vehicle approached from either direction. The gate camera showed no activity. No radio call announced an authorized arrival. He returned to the road feed. Both front doors opened. Two men stepped out. At first, Nothing about them seemed clearly impossible. They wore dark clothing and appeared similar in height and build. The camera resolution was not sharp enough to show their faces. Then they began moving. Their feet did not seem to meet the pavement. Each man crossed away from the car with a smooth, level motion. There was no rise and fall through the shoulders, no shift of weight from one leg to the other. They appeared to glide several inches above the ground. The guard adjusted the monitor and enlarged the image. Digital enlargement created blocks around their outlines, but it did not change the movement. Their bodies passed over the road without the small, uneven motions that belong to walking. They stopped side by side. Both faced the open desert beyond the road. For nearly 2 minutes, they remained there. The guard watched for a hand signal, a radio, or some sign that they were inspecting the area. Neither man raised an arm. Their heads did not turn. They did not speak to each other. They did not appear to blink. Even from a surveillance camera, human stillness has movement inside it. A person breathes, their balance shifts, their clothing reacts to wind, their attention moves from one point to another. These figures seem fixed. The guard checked the timestamp, 3:03 a.m. The seconds continued normally. The image was not frozen. Dust crossed the road behind the men. A loose branch moved near the edge of the frame. Only the figures remained still. Then the guard noticed the streetlights. Several lights stood behind the men, placed far enough apart to spread pale yellow light over the road. The sedan cast a long shadow toward the lower edge of the screen. The nearby rocks cast shadows. A roadside post cast one. The men did not. The guard changed the brightness and contrast settings. Nothing appeared beneath them. No dark shape stretched across the road. No faint outline followed their legs. The light reached the pavement behind, beside, and apparently through the spaces where their shadows should have fallen. The light refused to touch them. The guard leaned back from the screen. His first thought was a problem with the camera. A compression error might remove detail from a dark figure. Poor exposure could blend one shadow into another, but the sedan remained clear. The rocks remained clear. Oh, every other dark object in the frame behaved normally. The radio on the desk crackled. Another guard spoke through the walkie-talkie. "Are you seeing the same thing?" The first guard picked up the radio. He asked which camera. The answer came immediately. The road feed, near the outer perimeter. For a few seconds, neither man said anything else. The call mattered. Whatever appeared on the monitor was not an image only one tired guard had misread. Someone elsewhere, in the security system, had noticed it too. On the screen, the two figures moved again. They did not turn in a normal way. Their bodies shifted toward the sedan, while staying almost perfectly upright. Then they glided back across the road. The car doors opened. The figures entered. No interior light came on. The sedan began moving without headlights and continued toward the edge of the frame. As it disappeared, the camera feed cut out. Every monitor in the room went black. The guard stood. A moment later, the screens returned. They were no longer showing the night. Bright daylight filled each monitor. The main gate stood beneath an afternoon sky. Patrol vehicles occupied spaces that had been empty hours earlier. Workers crossed one frame wearing clothes from the previous shift. The system was playing recorded footage from earlier that day. The guard moved from one console to another, trying to return the cameras to live view. The controls responded slowly. Several feeds blinked between daylight and a black screens. Then, without warning, the live night images returned. The clock showed a little after 3 a.m. The black sedan was gone. The road was empty. The guard opened the recording archive. There should have been a continuous file from the start of the shift. Instead, the section beginning at 3 a.m. jumped directly to the empty road after the feed returned. The arrival was missing. The two figures were missing. The daylight footage that had appeared on the monitors was not stored in that location either. The entire event had been removed. He called the other guard, who had spoken over the radio. At first, the man confirmed what he had seen. A car, two people beside the road, something wrong with the way they moved. Later, when supervisors began asking questions, his answers became shorter. Eventually, he said he was not sure. The contract guard reported the incident to his supervisor before sunrise. The supervisor listened without looking at the screen. He told the guard not to worry about it. Camera systems sometimes failed, he said. Old footage could appear during a reset. Compression problems could distort people moving in poor light. The guard mentioned the missing recording. The supervisor advised him to focus on routine patrols. No formal technical review was ordered while he was present. No written explanation followed. Other guards were asked whether they had noticed anything. Some said no, others avoided answering. The road camera continued operating normally. Several days later, during another overnight shift, the guard saw a dark car parked on the same stretch of road. This time, the vehicle had no lights and no visible occupants. He asked a patrol unit to check it. By the time he reached the location himself, the sedan was empty, the doors were locked, the engine was cold. There were no tracks leading away into the desert that he could clearly identify. When he returned to the control room, the car was gone from the camera feed. No one reported seeing it leave. People living near Hawthorne sometimes spoke about unusual lights near the base. They mentioned distant glows behind the hills and low noises at night that did not resemble ordinary aircraft. The guard had heard those stories before. He had never given them much weight. A military area attracts rumor. Classified tests take place out of public view. Cameras fail. Recordings become restricted. Employees are sometimes told not to ask questions about activity outside their duties. That explanation remains possible. But camera errors do not normally remove themselves from secured archives. They do not cause two separate guards to react to the same figures at the same time. And no ordinary test explains two men standing beneath streetlights while casting no shadows at all. The guard still works there. Access to the feed covering that road is now more restricted than it was before the incident. The 3 a.m. archive is kept under additional controls, though no one has explained why. He continues to watch the monitors. Most nights remain ordinary. Dust moves, lights blink, empty roads stay empty. Yet whenever the clock approaches 3:02 a.m., his attention returns to the same camera. In every other account tonight, the pattern began with a witness seeing something strange. The visitors arrived later, after the light, the object, the missing time, or the damaged record. Outside Hawthorne, the order changed. The visitors themselves became the event. A professional surveillance system watched them arrive. Another guard confirmed the sighting. The road, the car, and the figures were held on camera. For a few minutes, the record had them. Then every screen blinked. The night was replaced, and when the system returned, it remembered nothing. The strange event was never the end. In every account tonight, something followed. A knock at a door, a car waiting outside, a missing file, a warning spoken softly by someone who already knew what had happened. No witness learned who the visitors were. No one discovered how they found the right airstrip, motel, trail, or house. The questions remained unanswered, while the evidence faded, broke, or disappeared entirely. What survived was the silence above a field, the silence over a lake, the silence inside a forest and along an empty road. Again and again, the witnesses described the same sudden absence of sound, as though the world had gone still long enough for something else to pass through it. Some of you may still be listening closely. Others may already be drifting towards sleep. Either way, these questions can rest where they are tonight. But the witnesses returned to ordinary lives. They took different roads home. They checked their mirrors more often. They kept empty cases, damaged files, and memories no one else could verify. The answers, if they exist, can wait for another night.